denizens of the night. Welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from a rocking chair in front of a burning Yule log, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll have our very own most viewed of 2024 Wrapup show. But up first, we have a brand new to the channel story from A.G. Hilton. This one comes from his excellent collection of short stories called Nightside Tales. It's quite topical. A young couple are headed back to Brighton to visit family over the holidays. But you know how family secrets just can't seem to stay buried at the dinner table. Well, a real doozy of a secret bubbles up, and is just the thing to get us into the mood for some wintery horror. After Home for the Holidays, I have included the 4 most watched episodes from 2024 in their entirety, complete with my opening and closing remarks for your perusal. Don't forget that last year I recorded 3 classic Christmas stories for your enjoyment, so if you'd rather start with those, I'll link them now and at the end of this video. I'll be back with you in January, so keep a midnight vigil by your radio until then. Thank you for all your support this year, and let's look forward to many more new and thrilling things coming in 2025.
Home for the Holidays. Snow began falling just as they hit the outskirts of Brighton. Having grown up in Florida, Alicia had little experience with the phenomenon outside of movies. Now, as they cruised toward Main Street, with the fluffy flakes dancing in the twilight sky like little winter fairies, she felt she'd stepped into a dream. All around the town square, cars, sidewalks, and trees were coated in a white blanket that reflected the twinkling lights hung about. Wow. Pretty, huh? Jared said. I forget you've never seen any in person. It's beautiful. You're lucky. We don't always get it around here on Christmas. Usually you gotta go closer to the mountains, say nearer Asheville or Boone for a better chance. Guess it's a Christmas miracle then. Alicia squeezed Jared's thigh. I honestly don't think I could be any happier. Oh yeah? That's great, baby. She watched him drive. He smiled, but she sensed something strained about it. He'd been so quiet for most of the trip. How much longer? She asked. To your parents? Not much longer. They're just a little way out of town. That's good. Silence fell between them like the snow piled there. You okay? She asked eventually. Me? I'm fine. Why do you ask? You just seem on edge. Look, I get it. First time I'm meeting your folks. These things can be awkward, but it's gonna be fine. Yeah, I know. You're right. Then what makes you worried? I'm not worried. She put a hand on the back of his neck and massaged the muscles there. Yeah? Well, this tension begs to differ. You embarrassed of me? What? No, it's not you at all. What then? Your parents into fringe politics or something? Real religious? They're just kind of different. They stopped at a light. Alicia took his chin in her hand and turned his face toward her. Baby, stop worrying. No matter what goes down, I won't think any less of you. I love you, you know. She pressed her lips to his. The light turned green, and he pulled back quickly to focus on the road. Let's stop for a second. I thought we were trying to make dinner in time. Dinner can wait. Here's all this snow falling, and you're in this stuffy car instead of catching flakes on your tongue? Jared swung the car into a parking spot on the side of the road. Come on, let's walk around in it for a bit. The world felt muffled under the accumulating snowdrifts. Despite the cold air, there was something comfy and tranquil, almost womb-like about the stillness. The businesses along Main Street were closed, but white lights gleamed in each of the trees and from the glass storefronts. And for perhaps the first time in her life, Alicia really felt that warm Christmas feeling that all the movies talk about. The two of them walked on, both drinking in the silent and beautiful night. Heedless of the chill, she pulled her hand from her jacket pocket and sought Jared's until his hand enwrapped her own. She took a moment to reflect on the year to that point and marvel at how things had turned around. This time last year, she'd been 2 steps from homeless, but she'd managed to fight on. And then she'd found Jared, and everything had fallen into place. They'd only been together 3 months, and already she'd made the decision to move in with him. She knew to some it seemed too much too soon, but to her it was a relief. She could trust Jared. Being with him meant finally not having to watch her back all the time, and for the first time she felt safe and stable. What was it like growing up in a place like this? She asked. Kind of boring, I guess. Small town like this, nothing much happens. Mostly I just wanted to get out. Come on, Mr. Grinch. She stopped him, wrapping her arms around him and drawing him close. You can't seriously tell me it's not a tiny bit special coming back to a place that's literally like a Christmas card and to parents who look forward to you coming home without feeling a little bit of that Christmas magic. His lips smiled, but she noticed his eyes didn't follow through. It's always tough coming home. Lots of memories here, lots of history, you know? She wanted to pry further. Jared had always been reticent about his family. In fact, before the invitation had arrived, he'd scarcely mentioned them. And though he didn't seem thrilled by the idea of coming home, home he came, nevertheless. In the end, she decided it wasn't the time or place, and figured she'd find out enough when they arrived for dinner. She kissed him again. Whatever you say. I'm just happy to be along for the ride. They left the twinkling lights of town far behind. The world outside tipped into a wintry darkness that pressed eagerly against the car. Trees bent over the road in places, the movement of the car's illuminating headlights creating the illusion that the gnarled branches were reaching down toward them. At last, Jared turned up a steep gravel drive that wound its way to a hilltop clearing. Looking back, Alicia could see the lights from town reflected against low clouds at a distant point in an otherwise inky night, devoid of moon and stars. Ahead of them, a house stood at the clearing's center. It looked cut from a Christmas piece by Currier and Ives, a clapboard farmhouse with a tin-roofed stoop and windows that glowed with soft orange light, replete with a thin coil of smoke drifting from the brick chimney. Jared threw the car into park next to an old Ford pickup. Well, here we are. This place is beautiful. I'm glad you like it. Jared got out of the car and made his way to her door. While shrugging on her coat, Alicia saw a shadow drift to one of the upstairs windows and then disappear. No sooner than she'd stepped out of the car, the front door of the house flew open with a burst of that soft glow, and 2 figures emerged in silhouette. The first petite, the second tall and broad. Well, there they are! came a slightly shrill voice, which cut through the snowy quiet. Jared began making his way toward the front stoop, and the two figures there. Alicia trailed behind until they reached the steps. The petite figure descended, and the silhouette resolved into a thin woman with a shagged haircut. The woman's age was uncertain, most likely upwards of 60, judging by the gray hair and the deep crow's feet at her eyes, but she moved with a litheness that was at odds with her looks. "Jay, good to see you." She took her son in a forceful hug that Alicia noticed was not entirely reciprocated. "We got worried with how steady the snow's been. Thought you might not make it back." "Made it just fine." "Wonderful. And who's this you've brought along this time?" "This is my girlfriend, Alicia." Alicia stepped forward and offered her hand. "Good to meet you, Mrs. Blake. You've got a beautiful place up here." "Oh, come here, darling." Jared's mother bypassed her hand altogether and took Alicia in a tight hug. "This is how we greet family. We've been so looking forward to meeting you." "Oh, glad to be here, Mrs. Blake," she managed after a moment. Jared's mother pulled back and studied her, holding on to Alicia's forearms for a moment, before turning and pulling her along up the stairs. "Please, call me Melanie," the woman said over her shoulder. "And this is Bill." By the light coming from the door, the larger silhouette became a man, broad-shouldered and gray-headed. Like his wife, his physique belied the age the lines on his face suggested. His was a body still built for woodcutting, and thinking back on the pile of logs she'd seen by the shed, Alicia figured he still did his fair share of it. "Pleased to meet you." Bill's massive hand clasped and dwarfed her own. His voice was pleasantly deep and had a charming southern tinge to it. "Boy's never brought a girlfriend before. We're happy to see you could make it." "Jared's a really great guy. It was nice of him to bring me along." "Oh, he's a good boy, our Jared," said Melanie. "We're very proud of him." Entering the foyer, Alicia found the farmhouse's interior to be as charming and festive as the outside suggested. The house was filled with the soft glow of lamps and candles. A fire blazed in the living room, casting a cheery flicker of light all about. On the warm air came the scent of something sweet from a yet unseen kitchen. Melanie patted a couch facing the fireplace. "Sit down. Make yourselves comfortable. I thought the snow may slow you down, so I waited to finish up dinner just to make sure everything was hot and fresh." Bill came to her side. "May I take your coat?" "Oh, sure. Thank you." "No problem. Can I get you a drink? We got some great punch. Powerful stuff. It'll take the chill out of your bones." "That sounds great." When the two had left for the kitchen, Alicia grabbed Jared's hand and leaned close. "They're cute. I don't get why you were so worried." Jared smiled, again only with his mouth, and gave her a peck on the forehead. "Yeah, you're right. I'm sure it'll be fine." Dinner proved the most stuffing meal Alicia had eaten in some time. Jared's parents had prepared both turkey and ham, accompanied by heaps of creamed corn, green beans, and heavenly homemade biscuits. As they ate, Melanie encouraged her to get second helpings, and Bill was quick to top off her glass with a delicious punch. She wasn't sure what was in it, but it had a spiced flavor, complimentary of the holidays and her cozy surroundings, that made her feel like being wrapped in soft blankets. By now, whatever was in it had started to go to her head, but she found that with the relaxed setting, she didn't mind. "So, dear," said Bill, as Melanie began to clear the table, "where are you from? I'm sure you must have some family that are missing out on having you this Christmas Eve." "I'm from Florida originally, and not really. My mom died when I was little. Dad never really cared about me more than he cared about boozing. He's dead now, too." Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But all the better that you're here with us. Alicia attempted to stand and help carry her plate to the kitchen, but was gently pushed back down by Melanie. Oh no, you sit tight, dear, and let me take that. Bill's right. We're so happy to have you. We love having company for the holidays. Isn't that right, Jared? Of course. Jared's reply came out non-committal at best. The longer they were here, the quieter he had become. Alicia had carried most of the dinner small talk herself and couldn't understand Jared's darkened mood. She decided she wouldn't let it bother her. So far, she'd been having a great time. As if to punctuate the thought, Bill began refilling her punch glass. Oh, no, really, I couldn't. Nonsense. The festivities are just getting started. Mel has heaps of desserts waiting for us when we're ready. And we've still got one guest yet to arrive. We have to be ready to receive him. Oh, I didn't realize. She took another sip of the punch, despite her professed hesitance. Jared, you said it was just gonna be us. Ah, I'm sure he wanted to keep the secret, Bill replied. But I think you might know who's coming. Alicia felt confusion bloom in her warmly swimming head. She thought she'd misheard the question. How should she know who else was coming? She glanced at Jared with a look she hoped didn't give away too much pleading, but he averted his gaze. A sinking feeling began to fill her stomach. Well? Bill put his elbows on the table, clasped his hands, and looked at her expectantly. It's Christmas Eve, isn't it? That can only mean one person. Father Winter, of course. The inexplicable anxiety in Alicia's gut melted away. Only a joke. She laughed and allowed herself to relax once more. Oh, of course. But don't you mean Father Christmas? Bill continued to smile brightly and gave a chuckle. Why, not at all. This time, she couldn't keep the confusion from her face. Bill chuckled and patted the tabletop. Don't you worry. You'll see, you'll see. Now go on and enjoy that punch. We've plenty more. At the mention of punch, a sharp sting from her bladder told Alicia she'd need to ask for the restroom. Rising to her feet, she felt a head rush and wondered if she might not have overdone it already. Jared, she said, where's the restroom? He was on his feet and coming to her side. I'll show you. As Jared led her out of the dining room, she registered his father watching them with keener than normal interest. Under other circumstances, she may have thought it a look of outright suspicion, but it was only a minor bump in what was otherwise a voyage of increasingly smooth mental sailing. She'd have to take him up on that offer for more punch. It had her feeling fine. Jared had to help her up the stairs. A part of her wondered why they were going to an upstairs restroom. Surely there was one closer on the ground level, but the need to relieve herself dominated any desire to question. Yet when she tried to make a dash for the bathroom, Jared caught her arm. Hey, how do you feel? Me? I'm great. Awesome. Suddenly hearing the slight slur in her voice, she gasped. Oh, shit. I'm embarrassing you, aren't I? Here I am at your parents' for the first time, and I'm getting plastered. No, it's fine. Look, I think coming here was a mistake. What do you mean? Something wrong? He glanced back toward the stairs and pulled her further along the hallway, speaking low. I'm just having second thoughts, and I think we should go back. Now. Oh, come on, Jay. Will you give it a rest? Your parents are fine. Everyone's having a great time except for you, and you can't tell me why. I mean, I'd kill to have a nice place like this to come to for the holidays. if I tried to explain... Jared? Melanie's voice came from the foot of the stairs. You two okay? Yeah, Mom, we're fine. Come down here and give me a hand, will you? Alicia pulled herself from Jared's grasp. You go help your mom. I'm fine. I'll be down in a minute. And please, relax. I'm sure Father Winter won't want you uptight when he comes. She shut the bathroom door with a chuckle and half walked, half stumbled to the toilet. She relaxed and let her mind wander over the evening's events. That last comment about Father Winter stuck out in particular. Not a title she'd ever heard used, but it was probably a family thing. For all she knew, this Father Winter was just Bill in a Santa costume, come to make an appearance like Jared was still a child. She pictured the scene and Jared's certain chagrin and laughed again to herself. But the mirth faded as she rose on unstable legs and fumblingly washed her hands. After leaving the bathroom and standing perplexed as to which way the stairs were, it struck her that maybe she didn't feel right. She'd been wasted on more than one occasion, but this was different. The outside world felt distant, as if she was becoming unmoored, watching through the perspective of her body rather than occupying and controlling it. Jared? The call came as little more than a mumble as she clung to the banister and somehow managed to make it to the bottom floor. Panic bloomed in her chest, but this too was confused and increasingly distant. No one was around, but faintly she detected the sounds of hushed and furtive conversation. Drifting toward it, she made her way through the dining room toward the closed kitchen door. She almost burst in, calling for Jared, but a venomous female voice stopped her. There's no choice in this. You know that. You've always known. It's high time you did your part. Jared responded. But I can't. I won't. Not now, not ever. Bill's voice joined. Keep your voice down. Your mother's right. You know how this has to go. You knew that since you met her. Despite the fog clouding her mind, Alicia's stomach dropped. They're talking about me. It's different now. She's different, and I won't. Honey, came Melanie's voice. You don't have to do anything. We'll take care of it. Just stay out of our way, and we'll deal with her. Where is the little bitch anyway? Asked Bill. She heard him moving toward the door and backed away. Unaware of her surroundings as she was, Alicia backed into a dining room chair and pulled it down with her as she collapsed on suddenly weakened legs. Before her, Bill filled the doorway as darkness closed on her vision. She searched for Jared, but as all turned dark, only his father's voice filled her head. Oh, now look here. You've been letting her run around and she got all banged up. He's not gonna like that. Darkness held her. It wasn't unpleasant, that dark. There was something warm and cozy about it. It made her think of Christmas. Christmas dinner with Jared's family. It had been good, hadn't it? They'd stuffed themselves and then gone to bed. No, that didn't seem right. Her comfortable darkness was upset by fear. She remembered something dangerous, something dizzying. Bits of conversation came to her. They'd been talking about her. What about her? The warmth flowed out, replaced by an equally deep and numbing cold. She wanted the warm back, wanted to slip back into it as if into thick winter blankets, but something told her that she shouldn't. Voices came to her first, soft whispers on a chilling breeze. Then a pounding of pain filled up her skull, and her eyes blinked into a cold half-light. No longer was she in the cozy farmhouse, but outside, facing a darkened tree line. Above, the clouds thinned as slivers of silver moonlight reflected off the icy crust on the snow. She had no jacket and shivered violently against the frigid air. Though she tried to wrap her arms around herself, she found them tightly secured behind her, the rough bark of a tree bracing against her back. Well, damn, she's a feisty one. I think she's coming too. Blearily, she looked up to find Melanie close by and watching. Bill emerged from behind her, additional coils of rope in hand. You shouldn't fight it, he advised. I was hoping it'd help you. I'll go get you more. As Bill disappeared from sight, Melanie stepped in close and stroked her face. It'll be all right, dear. He'll be here soon. Alicia cast her gaze about frantically, breath puffing in white plumes across her chapped lips. Her mind raced, trying to make some sense of what was happening. She caught sight of Jared, standing some distance away, eyes downcast. Jared? Jared! What the fuck is going on? He looked at her for a moment, his eyes wet and reflecting the cold moonlight. But he turned away. Now you stop it with that, said Melanie. It's a great honor to be gifted, and you'll be doing a lot of good for that boy over there. You just think about that. Jared? That's right. Jared's our good boy. He brought you for gifting. Picked you out himself so as not to make things too messy. He's gonna be a good Blake boy, keeping the family going. You're all fucking crazy! What do you want from me? I've got nothing. Which is why you're a perfect candidate for gifting, dear. Besides, things will be so much better once he takes you. You've had a hard life. You won't have to worry about anything ever again. Alicia bucked against her bindings and received biting pain from the rope in response. Her vision blurred with tears, and realizing her legs were free, she kicked out at Melanie. But the old woman was deceptively quick and sidestepped the blow before slapping Alicia hard across the jaw. The tears came freely now, and she sagged against the tree. Reeling from the blow, she saw Jared step closer, hands raised as if to intervene. She looked at him and managed a hoarse, "Please." "Bill," called Melanie, "get back out here and give her some more medicine. She's being an ungrateful bitch." Melanie turned to catch Alicia staring at her son and got back in her face. "If you really cared about him, you'd quiet down and let this happen. Father Winter gets what he deserves, and all is well. The Blakes get another prosperous year, same way it's been for generations since the pact began." The heavy crunch of footfalls in the snow signaled Bill's arrival. "Hold her steady," he said, and supplied a flask. Melanie grasped her head, and again Alicia was shocked by the strength in the old woman's hands. Nevertheless, Alicia struggled with all her might. Bill tried to pry her mouth open, but succeeded only in dribbling liquid down her chin. "Hold still and take it." Without warning, he planted a massive fist in her gut, and the breath ran out of her. A feral cry filled the air. Alicia thought it the herald of whatever strange doom awaited, but instead she saw Melanie pulled away and thrown roughly to the ground. In her place came Jared, now pouncing on his father like a predatory cat. The two fell to the ground. The enraged Bill was up first, hammering his son with blows. Jared took the punishment and fell back. Just when it seemed he would be overwhelmed by the assault, Jared leaned back from his opponent and plunged forward once more, arms swinging in a wide arc. The blow took Bill Blake in the jaw and laid the older man flat on his back, stunned. "Jared!" Melanie screamed. "What are you doing? You'll be the death of us all!" "Too late." The words came wetly from the busted lips of Bill. "He comes." The clouds split, allowing the full and cold light of the moon to wash over them. All fell to silence, and the chill in the air deepened. Alicia almost sensed the world around, taking some surprised inhalation, and in the quiet, she heard something moving through the forest. A new rush of adrenaline filled her. She struggled against her bonds, totally uncaring of what damage she may be doing to her arms and wrists. Her guts writhed with a fear like no other, a sickening squirming felt by prey animals, sensing a predator's approach. And while she struggled, still she peered into the dark of the forest for some sign of the danger at hand. And as the land was laid bare beneath the moonlight, she saw it. 2 pinpricks of light flicked beneath the naked boughs. She knew them as eyes at once, vacant, animalistic, staring back with the reflected lunar gleam. Judging by their height from the ground, their owner stood no less than 7 feet tall. A skeletal body shifted between the tree trunks, no features distinguishable save 2 branching protuberances that may have been horns or antlers. White breath huffed from an unseen mouth. Melanie crawled to her knees and stretched out her arms, a low humming coming from her throat. Blood streaming from his face, Bill moved into a similar position. As Alicia looked on, only Jared stood, staring at the thing under the trees. He then turned with a haunted expression and began walking toward her stiffly, like a puppet manipulated by unskilled hands. A flash of moonlight gleamed at his side as he drew a knife and held it high. "You bastard!" she screamed. As he came close, she kicked out at him, but it was useless. With that distant expression, he came on and the knife fell. Alicia closed her eyes and braced her body. Again and again, the knife came down, until in confusion, she fell to her knees. A quick inventory of her person found no wounds. Jared stood nearby, knife still at the ready. Her bonds lay in tatters around her. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, but her legs felt numb beneath her. Jared came to her side and lifted her up. She could sense the thing at the forest's edge watching them. "Don't look at it," he whispered. "The hell are you doing, boy?" Bill approached, his face steaming with the blood that still ran there. "You'll ruin us!" Jared held the knife aloft. "Stay back!" He leaned close to Alicia's ear. "You have to run. Get the keys out of my jacket by the front door." "Jared, what?" "I'm sorry." He shoved her, and her legs managed to carry her forward into a ragged run toward the farmhouse. Behind her, there came an enraged howl that brought with it a new blast of frozen wind. A human scream then lifted into the night air, but she did not look back to see from which throat it came. Frozen hands fumbling with the back door's knob, she finally gained entry. The heat of the house burned against her frozen skin, but the feeling rejuvenated her and helped clear her head. As she entered the foyer, a loud thump sounded above, followed by an irregular clomping as something scrabbled across the roof. Jared's jacket hung next to the front door. She felt the cool metal of the keys in the pocket before throwing it on. No sooner than she'd done this, the same harrowing shriek she'd heard outside filled the house. An Arctic blast came down the chimney, snuffing the fire, while lights flickered once, twice, and burned out. All fell to stillness. Alicia heard no movement, sensed no signs of life. And yet, now that she had the means of escape, she could not open the front door for fear of what may wait outside. But gathering her resolve, she turned the doorknob and plunged ahead. She'd made it halfway to the car when the shadow descended before her, and landed heavily in the snow. She'd no voice left to scream with, and could only fall back and scrabble away until her back collided with the base of the porch. The shadow loomed over her. She tried to look up and glimpse her attacker, but the action made her dizzy, leaving only a vague impression of primal power. Instead, she tucked her head down and waited for the end to come. Minutes passed, and cold breath washed over her, but no tearing claws or gnashing jaws came. It just stood there. At last, she uncovered her eyes, keeping her gaze low, so as only to catch a glimpse of gray, taloned feet, which may have been wrought from stone and the winter-hardened earth. A hand entered her vision, long-fingered and clutching something rounded, which it dropped at her feet. Jared's eyes stared at her, empty and cold. 2 more heads were produced, until a decapitated family was created. Then the spindly hand seized her own and drew it up. Sharp pain arced down her arm as a claw pressed into her palm and came away dripping blood. She listened to a suckling sound, and then the thing huffed as if in pain. Another claw was offered to her, this one dripping black ichor. "Drink," whispered a voice in her head. The black fluid was sweet and warm as a night by the hearth. It took the chill from her bones and put strength into her limbs once more. The clawed hand came away, but the shadow remained over her. Yet, she no longer minded. The shadow felt warm, safe, and like 24 years of Christmas cheer lost to the turbulence of life, found once more. "Welcome home, lost one," said the voice. "You need not wander anymore. Here you can stay forever. You need do only one thing. Bring me more."
Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from the Bates Motel, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, I'm sensing an urban legend vibe in the air. Our scene opens as our protagonist, a young lady, is driving out to a trailhead to begin a multi-day hike during spring break. Her plan is to make the drive all in one day, stay at a motel overnight, and then begin the long trek the following day. Ha ha! I see the horror aficionados among you perked up when I mentioned urban legend-style horror and motels. Well, let's just say that there's a reason these rooms are so cheap, and there's always a vacancy. This story is called "I Spent the Night in a Small Town and Don't Think I Can Ever Go Back," and was written by Moonscar Island.
Several days ago, I left the Washington Peninsula for the Cascades and planned on hiking part of the Pacific Crest Trail over spring break. I had loaded up my car with my backpack, a little more than enough food, hiking poles, a first aid kit, and my grandfather's old revolver. The pistol was an 8-shot 22 LR, which isn't much, but it made me feel safe. Most people fear meeting wild animals on the trail, and I don't blame them. I've had my fair share of encounters with bears, and I know if I never run into a bear again, it would be too soon. but every time that bear would look at me like I wasn't even there. My revolver wouldn't do anything against a bear or cougar except make them mad, but that's because it's not for them. The wildlife isn't what worries me. I can count on one hand how many people in my state have been attacked by bears and cougars in the last 10 years. It's the others that scare me. Most animals don't kill for fun. This was also the first time I would be hiking for this long, all alone. Between the weather, the remoteness, and the terrain, anything can happen, and nobody will be around to hear me scream. If I got stuck, the best chance I would have at rescue would be to shoot my gun and hope someone hears it. Though I've never heard a gunshot and thought I should try to find the shooter. I had left my home late and headed east. The drive from the coast to the trailhead was about 5 hours. The plan was to drive most of the way, stay overnight in an inn, and drive another 20 minutes to the trailhead in the morning. Throughout the drive, I had an uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. It was like I had forgotten something. I went through the mental checklist of everything in my pack and tried to recall every campsite I booked. At stoplights, I would rummage through my bag blindly to see if everything felt like it was there. It wasn't until I needed to try my GPS on that I realized I didn't know where I was staying that night. In the confusion of making sure I had everything for the hike, I forgot to book reservations. I thought about parking at the trailhead, sleeping in my car, and starting in the morning, but I was already married to the idea of the inn. The plan to sleep in a decent bed and then eat my last real breakfast at a diner just before I started my adventure sounded so nice that I couldn't pass it up. The mountain town I planned to stay at was small enough that I knew it did not see enough outsiders to fill all its vacancies. How I wish I were wrong. The rain had begun to pick up as I entered town. The water slushed under my tires, and my wipers squeaked. I tried to see through the windshield, but my astigmatism was making it a blurry mess. I squinted my eyes and looked around, trying to find any vacancy signs. Just as this town's one road exited and the mountains began again, I saw it. A motel sign that read "Vacancy" in red glowing neon through the falling rain. I hung a quick left and parked up front. I turned off my headlights, grabbed my pack, and headed to the office. I tried dodging raindrops as I ran toward the building and quickly knocked on the door. The light from the office could be seen through the small curtained window. I cupped my hands against the window and tried to see inside. A wooden chair squeaked across the floor, and heavy footsteps started after it. The thumping and dragging of wet rain boots grew closer and closer to the door. I heard the sound of a turning lock and backed away from the door, trying not to break my nose. The door creaked open, and a nervousness began to form in my stomach. I looked back to my car and wondered if I could run to it in time. "Hello," a voice began. I shot back around to see an old lady standing in the doorway. She had on an old flowery dress, the kind with ruffles around the shoulders and long sleeves. Underneath, she wore one size too large rubber rain boots with fresh mud. A beaded chain hung from her glasses, and she seemed healthy for her age. She looked at me and smiled. "Well, you're a pretty young thing. Are you looking for a room?" she continued. She smiled and waited for my response. Despite the age of her dress, it was well kept, same with her overall appearance. Even what I could see of the office looked antiquated, with its wooden panel walls and glass hurricane lamps, but still clean and dusted. This woman's smile was different. The smell of her breath hit me when she first spoke. It looked like her teeth were rotting out of her mouth. Her gums had turned black in some areas, and several teeth looked loose. I held it in and swallowed, not wanting to be rude. "Yes," I said. "Just the night." "That's wonderful, sweetie," she said. I looked around at the empty road and trees surrounding the inn. The lack of light allowed me to see stars through the gaps in the clouds. "We don't get many visitors around here." I stepped inside, and the old lady snuck behind the desk. I waited for a moment as she got everything ready. My eyes began to wander and examine the office. Across from the front desk were 2 large leather chairs. A small table stood between them, and a doily and stained glass lamp atop it. On the walls were wooden planks straight out of the 70s and decorative hurricane lamps. What most caught my attention were all the stuffed animals. A deer head above the chairs, stuffed ducks, elk antlers, and all other manner of wild game, even a stuffed salmon above the front desk. I'm not unfamiliar with taxidermy, but this seemed excessive. It wasn't a hunting cabin. The rain was still falling hard, and I saw the black of the moonless night through the window. A loud thump came from behind me. I turned to see the old lady had pulled out a massive and even older-looking logbook. She cracked open the book about halfway, and the dust it kicked up made me cough. The old lady licked her fingers and started thumbing through the pages. The book was spun towards me, and she pointed to the next blank space. "Write your name and date here, sweetie," she instructed. She waved a pen attached to a chain in front of me. I took it and looked at the page. The last person to stay here was Evelyn Black, and the sign-in date read October 30th, 2008, and the sign-out read October 31st, 2008. I hesitated, trying to figure out how many years that was when I heard the old lady cough. I took that as a cue and wrote my name and sign-in date into the book. The old lady closed the book and told me it was $45 for the night. I thought it was strange to charge me on check-in, but I obliged and handed her the cash. Behind her was a wall of hanging keys, and she grabbed the one marked Room A1. The old lady moved from behind the counter and showed me to my room. The old lady led me outside into the first room after the front office. The key slid into the lock, and she opened the door. The smell of mildew and musk hit me instantly. It didn't surprise me, though, with our wet weather and a vacant motel. I walked inside and put my pack down on the bed. I walked back to thank the old lady at the door when I noticed no way to lock it from the inside. "Oh, you must be from the city, sweetie," the old lady responded. "Out here, we don't use locks because I know everybody and everybody knows me," she continued. I was taken aback, unsure of how to answer. I'd never come across a place with no locks. Even if that's how they do it in town, not having them at a motel was very strange. I thought about the gun in my bag and how it was only for the night. "Well, thank you for the room," I said, biting my tongue and forcing a smile. The old lady gave me a rotten smile back. "Sweet dreams," she replied, and walked away. I shut the door behind her and took in a deep breath. The musk made me cough again, and I took inventory of the room. There was a bed with a stand on either side and 2 lamps. Across from it was a small writing desk and the door to the bathroom. There were 2 windows by the front door. First, I shut the blinds and drew the curtains. If the door didn't lock, then it was best that nobody knew I was there. Then I took the chair from the desk and wedged it under the door handle until it was stuck in place. Then I finally felt a bit more comfortable. It was about 11 p.m., and I snacked on a granola bar I had packed for the trail. I slowly opened the packaging and cringed at how loud the wrapper was. I watched the dark bathroom like I was trying not to wake something sleeping in the blackness. I finished the bar and tried to sleep. I laid down in the old bed. The sheets made me feel gross, so I laid on top of the bed. The popcorn ceiling spiraled above me. I reached into my bag to look for my mylar blanket. My hand rummaged around my clothes and dehydrated food. The bite of cold steel grazed my hand. My eyes widened, and I retrieved the piece from my bag. I held the gun out in front of me and stared at it. My gaze narrowed. This was the first time that using it became a real possibility. I gripped it and aimed it at the door handle. The sight posts wobbled back and forth as my hand shook. I took a deep breath and stashed the gun under the pillow. As I settled into the bed, I tried to focus on the hike tomorrow and how I would drive straight through on the way back. The rain was still pouring hard outside my window. I could even hear a distant rumble every once in a while. The sound of a motor broke the monotony of the rain, and headlights shone through the cracks in the drapes. I opened my eyes and began to listen closer. The door of a car closed, and the office one opened. The old lady was still in her office and began speaking to whoever had entered. Their voice was deep, but what they were saying was unintelligible. I focused back on the window and the car's headlights and engine that were still on. I pressed my ear to the wall to hear what was said, but they stopped before I could get anything. The office door opened with a chime, and 2 sets of footsteps followed. The splashing of their boots was caught within the thumping of the rain. Their silhouettes passed in front of the car's headlights, casting long shadows into my room. I felt sweat pool on my underlip and quietly removed my covers. I slowly lowered myself to the floor and hid beside the bed. Please, please, I prayed. Don't stop walking. The figures passed the window and stopped. I reached over the bed and felt for the pillow. The doorknob turned. The chair stopped them for now. I gripped the gun handle. "Open the door, you little witch!" the old lady shouted. The man shoved the door, and the old chair started to crack. I pulled my revolver in front of me. My hands shook as I checked the safety. A loud crack came from the door. The old chair's back snapped, and the door was open. I looked over the bed, and he was tall, about 6'2", wearing an old hunting jacket and a large bag clamped tightly in his fist. Behind him stood the old lady. He rushed through the doorway, and I raised my revolver. The room lit for a moment, then silence. I looked, and the man was on the ground, and the old lady stood in shock. The old lady started to reach down to her boot. I shot again. I don't know if she was reaching for a weapon, but I didn't know what to do. She was a witness. I doubt the police would believe me over her. I grabbed my bag and stepped quickly over the corpses, gun still in hand. I entered the office and took that logbook with me. There's no way I could report this, so I'm just hoping I got away clean. I was pushing 70 miles per hour through back roads the whole way home, gun in my lap. That night, my Jeep stopped for nobody. My engine was about to overheat as I rolled into my driveway at 3 a.m. I collapsed onto the driveway and threw up on my lawn. Everything I had held in began to come out. Thank God it was as late as it was, so nobody saw their neighbor crying in their yard clutching a pistol. I sniffled and started to regain a bit of composure. The cold of the night was getting to me, and I didn't want to get caught on the lawn. I got my stuff from the Jeep and entered the house. I called some friends and told them I needed them to come over. While I waited, I looked over at the logbook. I wanted to look up that other girl's name to see if anything happened to her. I opened it to the last used page and nearly threw up again. Next to where I signed in, with different handwriting, it said I had signed out tomorrow morning.
Aha! Did you jot that last bit down in your journal of horror hazards? Let's see here. No flashing your high beams on the highway at night. But if someone flashes theirs at you, check your back seat. Watch out for hooks on your car door handle if you've been necking down at Lover's Lane. And here, make sure you double-check the logbook at your motel to ensure you won't be checked out early, if you catch my drift. I love monster stories and tales of fantastic hauntings as much as the next horror host. But sometimes, the stories which don't use any fantastic elements at all can creep under your skin. I've never been chased by a werewolf through the woods, but I have had the intrusive, anxious thought that anyone could be prowling around outside my hotel room. And those rooms have more than one key to them, too. I hope exploring that fear gave you a delicious shiver. If you enjoyed this story, please check out the author in the links below. Leave a like on this video and subscribe to hear more stories like this one every week. Let me know in the comments if you have a delicious urban legend to share. Whatever you do, keep one eye on any front door that doesn't lock, and don't fall asleep. Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from a lean-to covered in snow, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, I have a very special treat for you. I've got a killer mashup that is guaranteed to tingle your spine. I'm joined today by fellow horror narrator Nightside Tales, who will be reading an ominous and icy tale from A.G. Hilton. Picture, if you will, a harried man trudging through the alabaster purgatory of deep winter in the woods. The tragedy of his past always 2 steps behind him, and his quarry always 2 steps ahead. The man needs to fulfill his vengeance, but how far will he go in its pursuit? And what, ultimately, is the cost? This story is called The Beast, and was written by A.G. Hilton.
The huntsman rose from his makeshift shelter, sloughing off the remnant of another fitful night's sleep. His breath blew in plumes from lungs that ached, through a throat and mouth that were raw and tasted of copper. A hard frost lay on the ground about him, and the cold morning air made his limbs stiff and heavy. Yet as the first light of dawn cracked through the skeletal tree limbs, he knew it was already past time to get moving. The beast was afoot. He had tracked the creature for some time now. Perhaps it had been weeks, perhaps months. It had grown difficult to remember. He only knew he must keep pressing forward. The beast was closer than ever. This he sensed with utmost certainty. He had been too late to save the last few settlements, but not by much. The beast had remained one step ahead, leaving in its wake corpses that were still warm as if to mock him. Thus far, the thing had cut a steady path forward. Here and there a trail deviated to swallow up one more homestead, but always it pushed forward toward the mountains. The huntsman sensed something critical in that trajectory. Something lay in those dark hills, some ending. The beast's den, perhaps? A trap? Whatever the case, the huntsman remained undaunted. He would follow it into the hills if he must. As long as he and his quarry drew breath, he would hunt. Having loaded his sack, he struck off, the repeating rifle at the ready in his hand. Heavy boots crushed down the frozen grass and fallen pine needles. With his fur jacket and cap, he looked very much the predator on the prowl as he sought the beast's spoor. The trail was not always obvious. Sometimes a whole day would go by without sign of his target's passing. Despite this, the huntsman never worried. He always picked up the signs sooner or later. Their destinies were intertwined, he and the beast. Of this he was also sure. He made it so in his mind. Eventually they must come face to face, and only one would survive. As the sun rose higher on the horizon, the huntsman caught sight of deeply scored marks on a tree's bark where, perhaps, the thing had sharpened its claws. These signs he followed deeper into the trees on his northward path. The smell of smoke drifted to the huntsman, a surprise in such a remote wilderness, and he followed it with a growling stomach. Suddenly, the thickness of the forest broke away to a clearing in which sat a small cottage. Unlike those frontier homesteads encountered before, this one had somehow been overlooked by the prowling monster. Smoke curled from the small chimney and the whinnying of a horse drifted from the cramped stable nearby. As the huntsman watched, a figure emerged from the front of the cottage and froze on the ramshackle porch. Silence fell. The two stared on, breath pluming, neither moving. At last, the huntsman raised a hand in greeting, and the figure responded in kind. On the frontier, one could never be certain of these lone homesteaders, and the huntsman found himself more wary of anyone still living that remained in his path, always fearful of the beast's trickery. But as the huntsman approached the cottage dweller, he saw in the man's solemn gaze an honesty that disarmed him. The man was brawny and his face weathered, age uncertain. The huntsman thought his dark hair and ruddy complexion bespoke native blood. "You're lost?" the hermit asked. "I'm tracking. You're off the trails. None come this way except traders now and again, and I haven't heard word from the people to the south for nigh on a fortnight. That's because they're dead." The hermit paused to consider this. "And you?" "I tracked the beast." Silence then. The hermit studied him. The huntsman shifted, uncomfortable under his searching gaze. The man turned away. "There's no beast here. You best be on your way." "Wait. I've traveled far. If you would let me step out of the cold for an evening, I can trade with you." The huntsman turned to a pile of wood against the side of the cottage. "I'll even split wood for the fire." The man nodded after a moment. "You may stay if you chop the firewood, but put your weapon down inside." With some reluctance, the huntsman complied. He then went to the wood pile with the axe the hermit provided. Over and over he hewed the wood into smaller pieces, with each swing thinking only of the beast. "You've traveled a long way after one animal." The huntsman and the hermit sat facing each other on a pelt inside the little cottage as the daylight failed outside. The fire threw flickering shadows about them while steam from their bowls of stew rose to obscure their faces. "It's not an animal," the huntsman said. "I seek a monster, a man-eater." The hermit's eyebrows rose. "Maybe you know of it? Wendigo, I've heard it called in some places. I've tracked it north for some time, always toward yonder mountains." The hermit's brow furrowed. You seek that which can't be killed? No, I'll kill it. Wendigo is spirit, comes over a man, makes him monstrous, bloody, violent. One cannot kill spirit. The huntsman felt his grip on the bowl tighten. No, it's a beast. I've seen it in the flesh. Flesh can die. The hermit seemed to consider this as he stirred his stew. You've seen it? The huntsman strained to bring the memory to mind. It plagued him nightly in his dreams, yet still it was hazy. Perhaps that was a blessing. He could remember seeing its dark shape through the window on that fateful night. He tried to focus only on the image of the window, not the wet carnage that had lain at his feet. The thing had been but a silhouette. Trying to remember too vividly made his head spin. But he recalled the suggestion of bone white, raking claws, perhaps of antlers branching from the head. This much he told to the hermit. This sounds more of white man's tales than Wendigo's. The huntsman set his teeth. I know what I saw. The other man sat quiet for a time, gazing into the fire. And you were left alive. You should leave this alone. Go back to your home. Do not continue towards those mountains. I must. Don't you understand? It must be killed. Butchered just like it butchered those in the valley. And I'll do it or else be butchered myself. You're bloody-minded. As would you be, had you seen what I've seen. A tremor crept into the huntsman's hand as he set his bowl aside. I've seen gore-soaked battlefields back east in the war. I've killed men with my own hands, but none of those bodies were ever so savaged as what this thing leaves. To see that, to see it, in your home, your family. The huntsman stifled the sob that wanted to rise in his throat. Yes, my son, my wife, the little one in her womb. The hermit rose and studied the huntsman anew. He looked troubled. I understand your pain, but you must not go on. If it is a Wendigo that sets your path, nothing good can await you at its end. The best thing you can do is run the other direction. I have to follow. The huntsman met the hermit's eye. I'm determined. A man goes his own way. And with that, the hermit began settling in for the night. The huntsman watched his host as he arranged the blankets he had been provided. He could not trust this man or his advice, no matter how he felt at first. Anyone who would dissuade him from hunting the monster that killed his family could not be trusted. He sensed trickery here. Wondering dark things, the huntsman kept a watchful eye on his host, endeavoring to keep sleep at bay and his rifle within easy reach until the sun once more chased away the shadows. Despite his best efforts to remain vigilant, the hermit's soup warmed his belly and the huntsman dozed. As sleep rose to meet him, it brought with it the dreams which crouched ever ready to overtake him, dreams of the beast. He saw it, a shadow under the moon as it squatted amid the trees feasting on some fresh kill. Gore streaked the snow, hung in low branches. The huntsman smelled the blood as if it were before him, tasted it as if it were in his mouth. He wanted to vomit. Finally, having eaten its fill, the beast howled into the night, a warbling, tuneless whistle of a sound the huntsman imagined he sometimes heard in the distance. When he awoke, head pounding and body stiff, the sun had long since risen and climbed its way toward noon. The cottage was empty, and the horse gone. The hermit apparently left out early for his day's business. The huntsman stoked the low-burning embers in the fireplace and watched for the hermit's return. But as the sun moved closer toward midday, he knew he had to keep pressing on, lest the trail run cold. It was hard travel through the forest beyond the hermit's cottage. The huntsman forged across thickly wooded land, wherein he doubted any settler or trapper had yet walked. He found shelter as he was able, but the days grew colder the closer he ventured to the mountains. Despite his thick jackets and pelts, he began to worry over his journey. Days passed without seeing another human being, and scarcely seeing any animals. The signs of the trail grew sparser than ever. A gnawing hunger such as he'd never known settled deep in his stomach. Now and then he was able to shoot small game and drink the melted frost and snow, but his hunger was not abated, nor was the rawness of his throat soothed. The nightmares continued to plague him, and at length he began to lose hope. It seemed he had lost the trail altogether. Perhaps this was the beast's last trick, to leave him wandering until his strength gave out, only to be hunted down as it had been hunted. But rather than let it defeat him, the huntsman let the thought burn in his mind, heating his body and suppressing the terrible hunger and thirst. He'd not let it win so easily. When he had the beast's blood, then all these things would be satisfied. It was a blessing when he came upon a trail and a miracle when he found the wagon. At first, the wagoneers almost shot him for a bandit, but when he flashed some of his remaining gold pieces, they eyed his gun and haggard face with suspicion, but asked no questions and allowed him aboard. Gold in hand, the good folks told him they were part of a supply chain headed toward a mining settlement at the foot of the dark mountains. Just before dusk, they arrived. The settlement was in its infancy, little more now than an outpost for a new mining operation. Beyond a rickety saloon, general store, and a hastily constructed stable, there were no buildings. An encampment of lean-tos and tents squatted around the few structures, and the skeletal frames of other buildings were being raised on even as he looked. Miners and laborers milled about the muddy avenue as the huntsman drifted towards the soft glow in the saloon windows. Once inside, he paused to take in the scene. Men drank at the bar and played cards at the tables. Prostitutes shipped in by the mining company made their rounds, and on the floor above he saw a steady rotation of foot traffic through the private rooms. He drew stairs as he stood in the doorway, rifle slung over his shoulder. The stairs made him nervous, but for a moment he could not move as the buzz of life in the room washed over him. He'd not been so close to this many beating hearts in many a long day. It made his head spin. He was surprised the beast had not passed this way as of yet, and for a moment grew hopeful that he had perhaps beaten it to the mountains and might cut it off. No doubt it would come, drawn to all the blood and warmth of this place, and when it did, he would be waiting. He brought some food and drank the cheap spirits available. After his long days on the hunt, the liquor went straight to his head, and thoughts of the beast, his family, and the carnage of the trail felt pleasantly like a distant dream. When one of the women approached him, he readily pressed his remaining gold into her hand and stumbled after her up the stairs. After a hot bath and a quick, fumbling rutting, the weariness of his long-traveled road seized him. Vaguely, he heard the woman telling him his time was up and to get going, but in moments he was asleep and in the claws of a nightmare. He could do little but watch as the thing played out. He had no will left to him. He was with the beast on that fateful night past, and he could not look away or escape the creature's primal thoughts. The beast held the screaming one down. It had already torn the throat from the other that had tried to attack it, and it heard the last choking gasps in the other room. But the screaming one, that interested it greatly. Drawn as it was to the heat of live meat and rhythmic pounding of pulsing blood in veins, the beast had found a treasure in this one, for it sensed 2 heartbeats and hungered all the more. It tore into its prey, ripping and tearing until the hands which beat at it weakened and fell away. It bathed in the warmth of the blood, drank it down to soothe the cold rawness of its throat. Piece by piece it tore the meat apart and swallowed each bit to its chasm of a stomach in a desperate attempt to quell the unceasing hunger. When the last 2 corpses had no more to give, it leaned back and moaned its tuneless howl. Rising from its feast, movement caught its eye. Something through the dwelling's window. It launched for its prey, but as it threw itself through the glass, it found only darkness outside as its reflection splintered. The huntsman staggered to his feet. He lay on the floor of the saloon's private room in which he'd passed out. Light slipped in from around the curtain, and he realized he'd slept most of the day away. His head felt as if a railroad spike had been driven through it. His mouth was cotton dry, and his throat wretchedly raw. The day prior was hazy, and the drinks had been too much. At once he remembered his gold-bought companion for the evening, and shame joined in on his hungover condition. He sat on the edge of the bed, the night's visions teased at the edges of his mind, seeming somehow closer to remembrance than usual. But he could not recall them in full, and did not try. No sense in dwelling what can't be fixed. By some miracle, his clothes and the rifle lay untouched in the corner where he'd left them. He thought he would have been robbed, passed out as he'd been, but it seemed no one had disturbed him. He was surprised no one had come to throw him out in the night. Then he noticed the silence. As he slipped into his clothes, he listened intently for a footfall or a murmur of voices. Surely someone would be about at this hour. There ought to be the sounds of hammering and construction from the half-built buildings as there had been the evening prior. But the only sound that came was the occasional moan of the wind. Blood ran cold in his veins. He reached for the doorknob, praying against what he expected to find, but knowing what lay in wait just as it had all those times before. The smell hit him before the door was opened. They lay all about on the floor below, some bloodied and torn, but intact, some in pieces. The bar shined slick with blood, the glasses filled with liquor that was not liquor. A ropey trail of intestines swung from one of the chandeliers. The huntsman felt his gorge rising as he picked his way across the bodies and into the open air. Outside, pale lights struggled through the wintry clouds to illuminate a ghost town. More bodies lay about the street, blood mixing with the mud. He heard not a hoof stamp or whinny of a horse. The coverings on the wagons lay in tatters. The huntsman did not search through the remains of the surrounding encampment. He already knew what lay there. The beast had confounded him again, and again left him to be mocked. Amid the partially devoured bodies, a numbness crept into him. It seemed he could, perhaps should, lay down in the muck with those bodies and give up. But he wouldn't let his resolve be broken. He picked through the grisly detritus, gathering what food he could carry and taking warmer jackets not so stained by the slaughter. He struck out, blood from the town still staining his fingers, toward the mountains. The pounding of his head subsided somewhat, and his throat felt better, though the coppery taste lingered in his mouth. In another small blessing, he realized for the first time in a long time he didn't feel so hungry as he plodded into the hills, gun slung over one shoulder, whistling low and tunelessly as he went.
I knew it! When did you figure it out? I had my suspicions at the hermit's cottage. The huntsman is so blinded by his goal that he can't stop and see the reality around him. I guess that's what happens when you take single-mindedness to its extreme. Let that be a lesson to us all. Be stubborn and persistent, but not so much so that it starts costing other people their lives. Let's take a moment to thank the two people who made tonight's story happen. It was written by A.G. Hilton, who wrote a number of other stories on the channel, and who has a collection of short stories you can read right now that is linked in the description. It's narrated by none other than your very own Midnight Host. So chances are, if you liked The Pit or Uncle Asher, you'll like those as well. Speaking of narration, tonight's narrator was Dark Night Tales, who has his own YouTube channel chock full of fantastic tales that he narrates, and some of which he wrote as well. I asked him to tell us a story tonight, because I think if you enjoy the normal fare we have around here, you'll definitely enjoy what he's doing as well. I'll put a card on your screen at the end of this video that will take you to a story he picked out just for the occasion. But before you head off to listen to some park ranger stories, won't you leave a like on this video and show our writer and our narrator some love in the comments? Whatever you do, make some time for some self-evaluation and introspection, won't you? And don't fall asleep. Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from reserved parking, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll take a drive out to the old abandoned Holly Hills Mall. Urban explorers everywhere are drawn to abandoned malls like moths to a porch light. There's something enchanting about seeing such a large structure frozen in time, like a snapshot of the past that you can step into. You might have experienced this during the pandemic. I recall that movie posters and flyers on storefronts lingered way past their expiration date, sometimes years. But I digress. The topic of our story tonight is in fact not the mall itself. It is the parking garage nearby. Our intrepid explorers decide to have a quick look inside before traveling on, and they discover that this garage has subterranean parking. Who could resist a quick peek into that pitch darkness? Surprisingly, the garage continues down. First 2 floors, then 3. How much further can it go? And why? This story is called I Still Don't Understand What Happened to Me in the Holly Hills Mall Parking Garage, and was written by Incident OK 9368.
I don't know if there's like a specific format to these posts or something, but I'm just gonna get straight to it. I'm posting this because, I don't know, maybe someone knows more about this. Maybe someone can help me figure out what happened to me and my best friend in the Holly Hills Mall parking garage. My name is Ethan, and my friend Aaron and I have a bit of a niche hobby. We're urban explorers. Basically, for the uninitiated, that just means we like to explore abandoned, man-made structures. My favorites have always been places like water parks and theme parks. Aaron is more into the spooky stuff like hospitals and such. We can freak ourselves out at times, but for the most part, we never believed in anything other than the corporeal. We've been doing this in our free time for around 10 years now, so we're pretty experienced. We know what to bring, how to avoid getting caught by the police or security, and when to get the heck out of a place. Recently, we went to go visit my brother for a few days in Virginia. He just had a new baby, and I wasn't able to make it down for the birth, so I'm making it up for it a few months later. He lives in a small town called Holly Hills, about 30 minutes out from Richmond. It's a pretty boring place, but my brother tipped us onto a cool spot to check out near town. An old abandoned mall simply named the Holly Hills Mall. It was built in the early 80s by some wealthy lumber family that wanted to bring more people to the town. Houses need lumber, and that means more money for them. As you can guess, it didn't really work out. The mall was operational for about 7 years before it shut down in 1987. I know none of this is really important, but this helps me get my thoughts in order, and honestly, the history of these structures is part of the allure for me. Anyway, we decided it would be fun and planned a trip on the last day in town on the way to the airport for a late flight. We woke up bright and early, packed our bags and supplies into the rental car, and said our goodbyes to my brother, his wife, and their kids. The mall sat right on the edge of town. I thought this was odd, seeing as how they usually build that kind of thing central to town for ease of access, but I didn't think much of it. The mall was surrounded by pretty heavy brush and trees, as well as a tall chain-link fence. The entrance was blocked off by a typical dilapidated gate, held closed by a simple chain and padlock. Aaron pulled up to the gate, and I hopped out to appraise the situation. Oddly, the padlock wasn't even locked. Unusual, but not unseen. Sometimes people just stop caring about these old places and don't even check on them anymore. Honestly, it makes us a bit more relaxed in these situations because it usually means no security. I opened the gate and Aaron pulled the car through. The building wasn't the biggest mall we've seen, but it was bigger than we expected. We drove through the deserted parking lot and pulled the car up to the first entrance we saw. We grabbed our supplies and entered the building. The mall exploration itself was pretty uneventful. It was cool to see all the ads and architecture that seemed frozen in time, like we stepped back into a stale, post-apocalyptic version of the 80s. There was a pretty massive hole in the ceiling where the skylight had given way to snow or the elements or something. The tree that sat in the center of the courtyard had grown massive and was protruding out of the hole in the ceiling. Aaron does these explorations for the fun of it, but I am a bit of an amateur photographer, so I do it for the photos mostly. I snapped a bunch of what I think would have been amazing photos, but unfortunately, I lost the camera. Well, I didn't lose it per se. I know exactly where it is, but we'll get to that. During the mall exploration, I did have a feeling that we were being watched. Distant sounds of glass crunching underfoot, or a figure just out of the corner of my eye that disappears right when you look in its direction. But I knew this was just my mind playing tricks on me. There were no signs of security, and no real reason that, even if the cops knew someone was in the building, they would even care to come check. At least that was my thoughts on it, so I ignored it. We hung out in the food court for a bit, ate some sandwiches we had packed for lunch, and then decided to make our way to the car. We got to the car, loaded up, and headed out. But on our way to the exit, we noticed a parking garage. It was a 5-story garage from the looks of it, and though usually uninteresting, for some reason Aaron wanted to check it out. We spent less time in the mall than we thought we would, so I figured, what the hell, we had the time. We entered the garage on the first floor, marked as floor 0. We drove up to floor 4, did some donuts, and Aaron tried his best to reenact Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift on the way down. I was clenching the entire time, of course, because I didn't want to die, but also it was a rental car. We didn't have the money to pay for damage done by joyriding in an abandoned mall parking garage. We got back down to floor 0, had a laugh, and started toward the exit, until we noticed the ramp heading down to a lower floor. Aaron pointed out how odd it was that there was a huge parking lot plus a parking garage with 5 floors above ground and seemingly subfloors below ground for a fairly small mall in a small town. So we thought we'd make one more detour to see what was down there. Obviously, we were expecting either darkness or water, and we found the first option, darkness. Aaron turned on the brights, and we drove around and found nothing, as expected. What we didn't expect was to see another ramp down to another subfloor. So of course, we decided to make a game of it. We both guessed how many subfloors this garage had, and Aaron headed down the ramp. I had guessed 2, that this next floor was going to be the bottom. He said 5. He was being stupid, but imagine our surprise when there was yet another subfloor. We both laughed in disbelief when we came around the corner on the 4th subfloor to see a ramp down to the 5th. This is a 10-floor parking garage, including floor 0, for this mid-size mall in this tiny town? What were they thinking? They really overestimated the draw that this place was going to have. Curiously, we headed down to subfloor 5. At this point, it was dark. Like, super dark. There was no other light from anywhere other than our headlights. We rounded the corner and were in silent awe to see yet another ramp down. We both looked at each other, and I think one or both of us said, "What the hell?" Without further discussion, Aaron steered the car down the ramp to the next floor. For the next 6 floors, we drove on in awe and confusion. We were now 11 floors underground. It didn't make sense. Aaron started coming up with theories, getting excited that maybe we'd found the entrance to a secret government base or a sprawling underground doomsday bunker. But he stopped mid-sentence when we both saw something we weren't expecting. A car. It was parked in a spot with its headlights on. As we pulled closer, I decided to roll down the window to see if I could hear anything. Immediately, the unexpected cold from the parking garage filled the car. It was mid-May at the time and was a fairly warm day, so the cold felt out of place. But we were underground, so I chalked it up to that. I could hear the sound of our tires against the pavement and the hum of our car's engine. As we pulled up next to the parked car, I could hear that it too was running. The car itself looked like it was an older make, something from the 70s or 80s. Inside, it was seemingly empty. I suggested aloud that perhaps the car belonged to the owner of the property or a security guard who was doing his rounds and that he might be back any minute. But Aaron pointed out the car was covered in a thick coat of dust, like it had been there for a very long time. But it was running. I figured it just needed a wash. Aaron did what he does best and convinced me to get out of the car and investigate further. Only after a bunch of protest and suggestions that we just head out, but he persisted. I exited and carefully made my way around the car, looking inside for any sign of life. But inside there was nothing but leather car interior, except for the passenger seat, where a satchel sat, with a thermos resting on top. The keys were in the car, and the radio hummed softly with static. Oddly, everything inside the car also seemed to be covered in dust. Aaron urged me to open the door, and I decided to give it a try, but of course it was locked. I looked around the lot, only being able to see the door to the stairs and the elevators next to it, illuminated by the headlights of the 2 cars. I hurried back to our car, closed the door, and rolled up the windows. I urged him once again for us to make our leave. If there was a security guard lurking around, I didn't want to have to deal with that, especially before our flight in a few hours. Again, Aaron protested. He had to know how many floors this thing had. I can't say I wasn't curious as well, so we left subfloor 11 and headed further down into the depths of the structure. We continued on in silence for 12 more floors before I spoke up. This was messed up. It didn't make any sense, and at this point, it just felt wrong, dangerous. I was in the middle of expressing this to Aaron when I noticed he had stopped the car and was staring silently ahead. I looked and was astonished to see a horse. A frickin' horse. Just standing there. It had the thing around its nose, the reins or whatever, and it was just standing there. After a moment of staring in confusion, Aaron said something like, "Is that a freaking horse?" And I replied with some sort of grunt of confirmation. The horse finally turned in our direction, and I'm pretty sure I screamed when I saw the skin hanging off the side of the horse's face, his skull exposed beneath. It was then I saw the blood on the floor, a large streak going from beneath the horse's hooves off into the darkness. I didn't want to know any more. I wanted to get the hell out of there, and I told Aaron as much. Aaron, against his and my better judgment, wanted to go on. He wanted to know what this all was. But this time, I didn't let up. I was louder and more insistent than I've probably ever been with him, and he could see what I thought. So he agreed and threw the car in reverse. We backed up and started back up toward the ground floor. At this point, I decided to try my phone. I had figured I wouldn't get any signal underground, and I was right, but I tried it anyway. Nothing. Again, we drove in silence for a few floors. Aaron finally broke the silence to apologize, but I stopped him short. The floors were numbered. Ever since we started heading down, they were each numbered B1, B2, B3, etc. We were on B23 when we turned around and headed back up. But the sign I was staring at in that moment said B26. 3 floors lower than when we started heading back up. I thought someone was messing with us, but it was all too elaborate of a prank. Still, it was impossible. There was no way we were traveling further down by driving up the ramps. It was physically impossible. But there we were, floor B26. Aaron was just as confused as me, obviously. He got out of the car unannounced and walked over to the sign on the wall. He grabbed it and began to shake it, then stopped and stared, clearly trying to figure it all out. I rolled down my window and called for him to get back in the car. This was followed by another voice repeating my words. Not mine, not Aaron's. He froze in place as the voice whispered loudly from the darkness, "Get back in the car." Aaron did just that. He closed and locked the doors and rolled up the windows. We agreed that we needed to get the hell out of there. This wasn't fun or adventurous anymore, but we didn't know what to do. We thought we were getting the hell out of there. I remembered that we headed back up on B23, and we decided that we should just keep going up. If the numbers keep rising, we should hit ground level by B46. It didn't make sense, but it was the best we had. We continued driving back up. Aaron was driving a bit quicker than before, and just as we thought, the numbers kept rising, which seemingly meant we were descending. But we held out hope that it was just some weird fluke. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe we didn't see those signs on the way down. We traveled in silence again, all the way to floor B35. But it was an uneasy silence. We were afraid at every turn at what we might see. But there was nothing. Mostly. There were a few floors with things that I did notice. Some of them subtle, others glaring. Aaron was focused on driving and didn't seem interested in any of the strangeness we encountered on these floors for the most part. On one floor, I swear I saw a long dining room table with 2 figures sitting at either end, illuminated for only a few seconds by our headlights. Another floor seemingly had a cot in each parking space. They looked to each be occupied by a body. Alive or dead, I don't know. One of the strangest, that even caused Aaron to stop the car for a moment, was a floor that didn't seem like a parking garage floor at all. It looked like we had pulled into a forest clearing. The pillars of the garage, now tree trunks through the concrete ceiling, were still visible above. There were plants, grass, bushes, and a pathway leading to what looked like a small cabin in the distance. The window glowed as if there were someone home, and smoke seemingly billowed out of the chimney. The curiosity overcame my fear, and I rolled down the window. The sound of crickets, cicadas, and a cool spring breeze filled the car. Aaron and I looked at each other for a moment before Aaron blurted out, "Nah, hell no," and continued on up the ramp. Finally, after what seemed longer than it should have, we reached floor B46. Nothing. I started to cry. It was too much. The realization that we were lost, underground, without any way out, was starting to make me feel trapped. We were trapped. It was like I could suddenly feel the weight of every floor above us on me all at once. Aaron kept his cool. He tried to console me. He tried to offer explanations. But there was no explanation. We were in a labyrinth of a parking garage. Aaron started driving with purpose. He turned around and started down again. B47, B48, B49. He stopped the car, turned around again, and started driving back up the ramps. B50, B51, B52. He started to scream. Anger, frustration, confusion, all overflowing into a furious scream. Then, in a deafening echo, his scream reverberated around us, outside of the car, within the parking garage floor. The windows rattled. The car shook, and then shut off. We were now in pitch blackness. The interior of the car was only illuminated by my cell phone, which I had plugged into a USB port and had been charging. I picked up the phone and turned on the flashlight. Aaron was desperately trying to start the car, but there was nothing, not even a click. Then he screamed, this time in alarm. In front of us, in the darkness, were two large eyes staring right at us. I have to express that when I say huge, they were massive, each seemingly the size of the wall. They felt almost flat and unnaturally still, but you could feel the consciousness behind them. Something was staring right at us. The whites were snow white, and the irises were an icy cold blue. The pupils were dilated and pitch black. I said the F word at least 15 times in a row, and Aaron slammed his fists on the steering wheel over and over. A voice, seemingly inside the car, whispered again, "Get back in the car." Aaron's percussive maintenance seemed to have worked because the car started back up, without him even turning the key. Whatever was down here seemed to want us to leave. And we wanted to leave too, but we didn't know how. Aaron put the car in reverse and spun it around. I could still see the eyes in the mirror. He sped up the ramp, totally disregarding the numbers. He drove a good 6 or 7 floors before I noticed something standing out in the darkness. Each floor now had a dim light. I was able to calm Aaron down enough to listen to me, and I pointed it out. He stopped on the next floor to see the light in the distance. It was a door. The door to the stairs was illuminated by an emergency light above it. It was our only chance. It was our last option. He drove over and parked the car in front of the stairwell door, illuminating it fully with the headlights of the car. We both bolted out of the car. Aaron flung open the door, and we started running up the stairs. After the first flight, we saw the number on the stairs, B57. We were ascending. I started to tear up in excitement. We continued on, faster than before. For 20 floors, we basically ran, energized by the fact that the numbers were going down, which meant we were going up. Around B30, we started to slow down pretty significantly. We were still making our way up, but we were tired. It was then that I looked back for the first time. The stairwell above was lit on each floor, but as we made our way up to the next floor, the lights on the previous were turning off. Turning back to head up the stairs, I ran into Aaron, who had stopped in front of me. He was looking up at the top of the next flight of stairs. I looked at what had stopped him. It was a person. A figure huddled in the corner at the top of the stairs. They sat with their head buried into their knees, shaking. Their clothes seemed faded, old and dusty. Maybe a homeless person that had gotten lost. Maybe the driver of the vehicle. I called out gently to the stranger, something along the lines of, "Hello? Are you okay? Do you need help?" Aaron scoffed. He said we needed help. Screw this guy. He started up the stairs, but when he got near the top, he hugged the rail, facing the figure the entire time. Slowly, he rounded the corner and called me forward. The stranger didn't move. They just sat there, shaking, arms wrapped around their legs, face hidden. They were mumbling something, but I couldn't make out what it was. I followed Aaron's lead and carefully passed the person. Same as before, no reaction. We moved on, leaving the figure behind. Aaron led as before, and when I made it to the top of the next flight of stairs, I looked back down, startled to see the gaunt face of a man. His cheeks sunken in, his face pale and old, his eyes a piercing pale blue, staring at me, silent, unnaturally still. I didn't say anything. I slowly walked up and rounded the corner. He stared at me the whole time. Again, I ran into Aaron, who was looking up at the top of the next flight of stairs. It was a figure. It looked like the same stranger. I looked down at him on the previous floor, staring at me, and the next floor, face buried in his knees. We traded, "What the hell?" looks, but Aaron said, "Just ignore it and keep going. We're too close." So we did. Every floor after, he was there, hiding his face as we approached, staring at us as we left. It was unexplainable, but so was everything else so far. We made our way up, finally reaching B1. This time, there was no man in the corner. I looked back to the previous top step, and he wasn't there either. I felt like this was a good sign for some reason. We made our way up to floor 0 and were relieved to see light shining through the cracks of the door. Aaron stopped for only a moment and pushed through the door. He began to laugh. I followed him through, but the cold of the parking garage was back. There before us were the bright headlights of a car, our car, where we left it, on floor B58. I had no words. Aaron walked back into the stairwell and fell to the floor, distraught and broken. I told him we can just keep going. We could keep going up. But he wouldn't move. He was tired and defeated. His stoic bravery had finally given way to hopelessness and fear. So I decided to go up to the next floor to check it out. I ran up the stairs, and I felt a sudden warmth. I could see the light through the cracks of the door, but I knew it was different. I knew it was the sun. I burst through and was blinded by the sudden light of the sun. After the hours and hours in darkness, it took a few moments for my eyes to adjust. We had made it. We were free. we were alive. I ran back down to the previous floor to tell Aaron, but he was gone. I ran out through the door into the garage to check in the car, but he was nowhere to be seen. I called for him, shouted at the top of my lungs. My voice echoed through the parking garage, but nothing. I didn't know what to do. I started down the stairs, but stopped cold. I couldn't go back down. I couldn't get lost down there again. And then I saw, on the top stair of the floor below, the figure was back. It was Aaron, sitting in the corner, his hands wrapped around his knees, staring at me. I called to him. I ran down to him, but when I got to the stair, he was gone. I looked over the railing down at the next flight down, and there he was again, staring. I couldn't go down anymore. I couldn't. I called to him, pleaded with him to come with me, to get it together and get the heck out of there. But he just stared. I promised him I would come back. I cried as I turned around and made my way out of the garage, as I left my best friend behind to save myself, because I was too scared. I ran from the parking garage, across the parking lot, past the gates, and to the road. Finally, my phone had a signal, and I called the police. They came out, and I tried my best to explain what happened. I knew it sounded crazy, but I told them the truth. They went and checked out the parking garage. They searched the entire thing, as well as the mall and surrounding area. Nothing. In fact, they told me there were no subfloors in that garage. Like I dreamt it all up. How the hell could that even be? I was tested for alcohol and drugs and fined for trespassing. When my brother arrived to pick me up, I tried my best to explain what happened. But if it couldn't get any weirder, he swore to me he didn't know who Aaron was. They've known each other since we were kids. He's been my best friend for 20 years. But he swore. His wife, too. And kids. None of them remembered him. After that, I looked for any evidence of Aaron I could find. All the pictures on my phone were gone. My camera was still in the car, and there was no proof of his existence online anywhere. I didn't dream him up. I don't do drugs. I don't drink. I don't have any history of mental illness. I didn't make up 20 years of friendship. I've been seeing a therapist and started some meds. It hasn't helped. Nothing has. Something doesn't feel right. This world doesn't feel right. Like I came out of that parking garage into a life I didn't own. I feel like I don't belong here. Every day it becomes more and more clear to me that I have to go back. I don't know what I wanted to get from this post. Maybe just to tell my story. For people to know I existed. Aaron existed. Maybe to find someone who knows what happened to us. Who knows something about the Holly Hills Mall. Who can make any sense of it. Either way, I have to go back. I have to find Aaron. We have to get back in the car.
What a pickle our protagonist finds themselves in. Did you know there really is a Holly Hills Mall? It's in North Carolina, not Virginia, and it's still operational. And it probably isn't attached to a bottomless parking garage tenanted by a huge pair of lurking Lovecraftian eyes. I really enjoy the idea from this story that no matter which direction you go, you continue to descend. That made me feel trapped in a delicious way. Did you enjoy imagining the car's headlights slowly panning over increasingly unsettling tableaus as our heroes descended? There is definitely something otherworldly and liminal about empty parking garages, and the effect is quite intensified in the dark. Huh, there's an image to take with you to bed tonight. If you enjoyed this story, please check out the story in the links below. I have it on good authority that the author has another story planned that is thematically similar to this one and may take place in the same universe, but it will be posted from a different account. So keep your eyes on the No Sleep feed for that. Please also leave a like on this video and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Whatever you do, keep ascending the stairs and never give up. And don't fall asleep. Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from a moonlit cornfield on a windy night, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll... Oh, hang on. This part is actually already written for me, and in a classical style to boot. Here, listen to this. They were two very ordinary straw men on adjacent farms. Nice playmates for a couple of imaginative kids. Then Jimmy gave a knife to the dangerous scarecrow. How fun! Oh, I can't wait to hear this one. This story is called The Dangerous Scarecrow and was written by Carl Jacobi.
Both Mr. Maudsley and Mr. Trask were resplendent that October evening. Mr. Maudsley stood deep in the cornfield, overall trousers ballooning in the wind, one hand nailed to a pie tin that caught the moonlight and reflected it like a mirror. While across the road, the hat of Mr. Trask was bright with the strip of foil Jimmy had fastened to it that morning. From the rear seat of the car, Jimmy looked down upon the two figures as the road wound between the shocked fields. Next to him, his sister Stella said, "Mr. Trask looks fine tonight. I think he likes the silver ribbon you gave him." Jimmy nodded. "Mr. Maudsley looks good, too. See the way his hand shines?" In the driver's seat, as he twisted the wheel to avoid a rut in the road, gray-haired Mr. Tapping coughed and glanced at his wife. "What are those kids whispering about?" The whispers died abruptly, and the car rattled over Goose Creek Bridge and began the long climb to the Tapping farm. They stopped at the roadside mailbox, but there was no mail. Then they were rolling up the cedar-lined lane, past the silo, past the barn, into the farmyard. Stella went into the house with her mother, but Jimmy remained with his father to open the garage doors. He snapped the big padlock shut after the car was put away, made a vain attempt to catch Higgins, the cat, and followed Mr. Tapping up the porch steps into the house. Upstairs in his room half an hour later, he undressed reluctantly and climbed into bed, wide awake. He lay there listening to the old house creak and groan in the night wind. From the distance came the mournful wail of a train whistle. Presently, Jimmy got out of bed, crossed to the window, and stood looking out into the moonlight. Below him, he could see his ball bat leaning against a tree, looking strangely white against the shadows. Beyond was the outline of a mounted horseman, the pump, and beyond that, the gray circular walls of the silo pointed upward like a castle tower. Something caught Jimmy's eye, made him look to the east. He looked again, then moved to the table and rummaged through the drawer until he found the silver spyglass his father had given him last Christmas. He carried the glass back to the window, pushed the window open, and peered out. In the bright moonlight, he could see Mr. Maudsley clearly, and a little farther on he could see Mr. Trask, two silent figures alone in the cornfields. The boy lowered the glass, wiped the lens on his sleeve, and carefully focused again. A puzzled frown furrowed his face. Save for the flapping of his trousers in the wind, Mr. Maudsley stood motionless, as of course he should. But Mr. Trask... A passing cloud slid over the moon, darkening the landscape. In the few seconds before it brought complete blackness, Jimmy thought he saw Mr. Trask kick up his heels, leap high in the air, and begin to dance a rigadoon over the shocked corn. At breakfast next morning, Jimmy waited impatiently for his sister to come downstairs. He hoped she would get to the table before his father, because with Papa present he couldn't talk, and he wanted to talk. When at last Stella took her chair, he stretched his foot under the table and kicked her slightly. "I've got a secret," he whispered. "Tell it to me," said Stella. "It's a big secret. If you won't tell, I won't give you any of my candy." Jimmy was silent a moment as he gave this thought. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "Mr. Trask moved last night." "He always moves," replied Stella, unimpressed. "I mean really moved, toward Mr. Maudsley." Stella choked on her porridge, and the spoon all but slipped from her hand. She stared with wide-open eyes. "He didn't." Their whispers broke off as Mr. Tapping strode across the kitchen and took his place at the head of the table. A heavy-set, unimaginative man who seldom entered into conversation with the children, he eyed them speculatively. But he said nothing and began to eat his eggs and thick strips of bacon. He ate slowly and methodically, keeping his eyes to the table. When he had finished his coffee, he settled back to light his pipe. He passed the match back and forth across the bowl with quiet deliberation.
"Who's Mr. Maudsley and who's Mr. Trask?"
His wife smiled. "Those are just the names the children have given the scarecrows."
"What scarecrows?"
"The one in our field and the one on Edmund's land." Mr. Tapping considered this, while strong curls of strong tobacco smoke rose about him.
"Why those names? Why not Brown and Smith?"
"Because those are their names," explained Stella patiently. Mr. Tapping cogitated on the mysteries of the juvenile mind. Abruptly, he remembered the section of pasture fence that needed repairing and got to his feet. But it was nearly noon before he got around to fence fixing, and then he had but one wire stapled when he heard a "Hello!" and, turning, saw old Jason Southby hobbling across the field toward him. Jimmy, who was holding the wire for his father, let go the pliers and joined Stella, who was trying to capture a bumblebee in a fruit jar. "Howdy," said old Jason, reaching the fence. "Got a couple of helpers, I see." Mr. Tapping smiled and nodded his greeting. "I came over to ask if you're gonna post your property for no hunting this year." "Don't think so," replied Mr. Tapping. "Aren't many grouse, and I don't expect there'll be many hunters." "No," agreed old Jason. "The birds are dying out. It ain't like the old days." Mr. Tapping nodded. "Remember when Maudsley was here? Things were different then." "Who did you say?" said Mr. Tapping. "Maudsley," repeated old Jason. "He owned your farm 30 years ago." Mr. Tapping shook his head. "Maudsley, huh?" Jimmy and Stella must have heard the name from one of the neighbor's children. "Yep," continued old Jason. "Maudsley had this place, and Trask rented the strip across the road." "So, quite a story about them two." Mr. Tapping said nothing. There would be no hurrying old Jason, and no stopping him either. The man obviously had a tale to tell, and he was enjoying every moment of this prelude. He bit off a piece of plug tobacco, chewed a moment, and spat. "It was the corn that started it," he said. "Maudsley was a great one to fool around with hybrids, and he worked out an early variety he called Maudsley No. 2. That ain't being planted anymore, but in those days it was well thought of. Then Trask moves into the farm across the road. Trask was from down south, from around New Orleans way, and he was fired up with all sorts of backwoods stuff. Pretty soon he began to fight with Maudsley about how good his hybrid corn was. Seems Trask believed the only way to grow good crops was by using voodoo spells. Got so them two couldn't come into sight of each other without starting an argument. One day, Trask got so mad he let his cattle loose in Maudsley's cornfield. Well, that settled it. Maudsley headed for Trask's place, armed with a double-barreled shotgun. But before he got there, Trask made himself invisible. "He did what?" demanded Mr. Tapping. "Well, anyway, that's the story Maudsley spread around. Funny thing is, folks believed him. He said Trask, being from New Orleans country, knew all sorts of voodoo spells. And he said that Trask, being afraid, had cast a spell over himself to make himself vanish. Of course, some persons were suspicious, and the sheriff asked Maudsley some questions. But Maudsley proved his shotgun hadn't been fired, and no one had seen him commit any crime. Trask was never seen around these parts again. After that, Maudsley got to acting sorta queer, looking over his shoulder, talking to himself. Then one day, he up and cleared out, and the next anything was heard of him, he'd moved south to New Orleans, the very place Trask had come from. Maudsley's still down there. He wouldn't come back even long enough to complete the sale of his farm." Jason's voice died off as he reached the end of his story. "Did you hear what he said?" said Jimmy in a low voice. "Sure." Stella rose triumphant from capturing her bumblebee. "I knew it all the time." It rained the next night, and even with the spyglass, Jimmy could see nothing in the cornfields. But he knew the two scarecrows were out there, and he could imagine them standing in the rain with beads of water dripping from their hats. The muddy water would be running in rivulets, between the rows of shocked corn, and when the lightning flashed, the shocks would gleam dully like so many stacked guns at an army encampment. Next day, after lunch, Jimmy drew his sister aside. "If you don't tell anybody, I'll show you the present I've got for Mr. Maudsley. Promise?" "I promise," said Stella. Jimmy led the way into the barn, and in the rear, near one of the horse stalls, swept aside a covering of hay. He picked up a long, rusty knife and displayed it with an air of pride. Stella was disappointed. "Just an old knife." "It's a voodoo knife, that's what it is. See the way the handle is carved?" Stella looked and saw a yellowed handle of what once might have been ivory, carved in the shape of a running goat with several quasi-human faces low down near the hilt. "What are you going to do with it?" she said. "I told you. Give it to Mr. Maudsley. It's his." "How do you know it's his?" "This is Mr. Maudsley's barn, isn't it? Besides, it was near his other stuff." Stella was not enthusiastic. "Papa won't like it. He got mad when you nailed that pie tin to Mr. Maudsley's hand." "Papa won't know a thing about it. Come on." It was hot in the cornfield. The morning sun beat down fiercely, and the air smelled of damp earth. The ground between the rows of stubble was marked with tiny channels the running water had cut the night before. But the shocks were dry again, and in the slight breeze they whispered and rustled gently. The two children made a beeline for the center of the field until they came to the two crossboards that served as a framework for the scarecrow. The scarecrow was fashioned of some old clothing which had once belonged to a fat man, overalls, a coat of what might have been a Sunday suit at one time, and an ancient felt hat, castaways, which the children had found in the barn. The cardboard face, marked in black crayon, a little blurred now from the rain, had been copied by Jimmy from an old photograph the boy had come upon among some old papers when he'd cleaned out the attic. Jimmy had decided that even a crow wouldn't be fooled by a faceless scarecrow. Jimmy was about to climb the upright shaft when Stella stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Let's not give Mr. Maudsley the knife." "Why not? It's his." "Let's give it to Mr. Trask." The boy's jaw dropped as the enormity of the idea grew upon him. Then he uttered a squeal of delight. Laughing and giggling, the two children turned and ran down and vaulted the fence that enclosed the Isle of Shocks to the road and adjacent field. 5 minutes later, the second scarecrow brandished a knife at the end of one of its handless sleeves. But as Jimmy came out on the road again, he looked across at Mr. Maudsley. In full view in the sunlight, it wasn't a cardboard face now. It was a round, full face with great folds of fat, and it was twisted in an expression of stark fear. For 3 nights, the skies over the Tapping farm were black, and a cold wind huffing down from the north kept the children indoors, where they played endless games of parcheesi. On the 4th night, the moon broke through the clouds. Jimmy, squatting by the window, the spyglass to his eye, stared out at the two scarecrows. At intervals, he thought he saw Mr. Trask descend from the mounting pole, leap up over the shocks, and begin his strange dance. But at the instant those capers began, the clouds always managed to blot out the light, and the boy never could be sure if it was a trick of his eye or the glass. And then Jimmy observed two things. With him in his gyrations, Mr. Trask carried the knife, and as he darted back and forth, he edged almost imperceptibly toward Mr. Maudsley. The boy watched a long time to confirm his fears. Then he turned and ran to his sister's room. "Mr. Trask is getting closer," he said. "You better come see." At the window, Stella spent several moments focusing the glass. Slowly, her body went rigid, and she uttered a hoarse exclamation. "He's going to kill Mr. Maudsley." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with terror. "We've got to try and stop him." She turned and ran down the stairs and through the lower floor rooms to the back door. Jimmy ran after her. Crossing the yard, they sped halfway down the lane, then pushed through the cedar windbreak and veered toward the cornfield. Pumpkins, golden in the moonlight, rose up on either side as they raced up the incline. Suddenly, Stella drew up short. "Look!" Mr. Trask had crossed the road and now was coming full tilt through the row of shocks. Jimmy, arms spread wide, threw himself forward to block the onrushing figure's path. He had a brief impression of a blurred shadow bowling toward him and passing through him while he struck out with his small fists ineffectually. Behind, there was a ripping of cloth and a hoarse scream. Stella came running to where Jimmy stood. Together, they saw two shadows locked in an incredible embrace. Like a scythe raised aloft, Mr. Trask's knife swept downward in a wide arc, and with a quick stroke, cut off Mr. Maudsley's head. Mr. Maudsley's hat flew up. Mr. Maudsley's head rolled off, and a thin cry of triumph welled up and faded. And then there was nothing, except that Mr. Trask was back on one side of the fence and Mr. Maudsley was on the other, minus his head, of course. "Gee," said Stella. "Golly," said Jimmy. He ran over to pick up Mr. Maudsley's hat. Jimmy tried to put Mr. Maudsley's head back, but somehow it wouldn't stick. "We'll fix it in the morning," said Jimmy. At the edge of the field, Jimmy paused and caught his sister's arm anxiously. "You won't tell, Stella?" "No, of course not." "Cross your heart?" "Cross my heart and hope to die." It was night of the next day, and the children sat playing parcheesi. Mrs. Tapping was knitting. Mr. Tapping, settled back in the platform rocker, was reading the newspaper aloud, as was his custom. Outside, Mr. Trask was in one field, and Mr. Maudsley was in the other. His head was back in place, but only tied on. It was not the same. It looked very dead, even though Jimmy and Stella had done their best. "Any news?" asked Mrs. Tapping. "Same old stuff. New taxes, one of them foreign countries talking big and threatening war," said Mr. Tapping. "One thing here, though. They found a fellow with his head cut off right in the middle of a city street." "My land! Not here in Acrestown?" Mr. Tapping laughed. "Lord, no. Happened way down in New Orleans."
As expected. A classic bit of horror featuring a bucolic landscape, likely set sometime in the 50s. This story first appeared in Imagination magazine in August of 1954, 70 years ago to the month. As of this recording, that is. It should seem fairly obvious that comfy, classic stories like this one are a favorite of mine. It's such a pleasant fancy to imagine young adults sitting on the floor around an old radio, listening to stories like this, and then gazing out their window that same evening, replaying the story and imagining themselves as the main characters. What would I do if a scarecrow came to life and charged at me? They might wonder as sleep takes hold. Our lives are so much richer when we let our imaginations run free. Wouldn't you agree? If you enjoyed this story, this flight of imagination, then please leave a like on this video and consider subscribing to hear more stories like this one. Whatever you do, don't arm the scarecrows and don't fall asleep. Denizens of the night, welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from inside your air conditioning ducts, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we'll hear a very emotional and unsettling tale. Our story follows young Tabitha, who is attempting to find a new normal after tragedy strikes her family and they move into a new house on Hyatt Street. But compounding this issue is the man, her mother's new boyfriend, whose gaze lingers on her too long and who torments her by the light of an old TV. Loneliness has taken hold, and Tabitha struggles to make friends at her new school. But there is more to the house on Hyatt than meets the eye, and only time will tell if it holds the answers to her problems, or the worst problem of all. Before we jump in, I want to let you know that this story contains references to abuse, but it is never described explicitly. This story is called The House on Hyatt and was written by A.G. Hilton.
Twilight dimmed to dark on a Sunday night, and Tabitha felt that hollow lonesomeness which always seemed to empty out her insides around this time. Having finished the dishes, and thinking she'd settle in for some reading before lights out, she went quietly through the dimming house. Ahead, she saw the way to the living room, the darkened doorway flashing with white light from the TV, accompanied by the cracking of rifle fire and a woman's hysterical screams. It looked and sounded like a storm was swirling in the room. She hoped it would cover any noise she made. She crept up to the door and bolted across its opening. She'd nearly gained the stairs when the voice stopped her in her tracks. "Hey, Tabby!" She stood bolted to the spot, willing herself to ignore the voice, to go on up the stairs and into her room. But she found her feet would not listen. "Hey, Tabs! Why don't you come in here a second?" Why did her feet listen to the voice? Why did they always? She found herself creeping back to the door and peeking inside the room. He was drunk, he always was in the evenings, and sprawled on the couch in front of a TV, on which a man was tossing burning bottles into a horde of zombies. Despite the fact that it was icky watching the creatures melt away in the special effects blaze, she let her eyes linger on the scene, not wanting to look at him, but he called again, and her eyes drifted. His chin bristled with ragged hair that cast the bottom of his face in shadow. And in the moments when the TV went dark, the whole face seemed to vanish, leaving only those leering eyes. "Where are you sneaking off to?" he asked. "Going to bed?" The reply was timid as a mouse squeak, and she hated herself for it. He pushed himself up on one elbow and flicked open his Zippo to light a cigarette. "Ah, so soon? Sure you don't want to sit and watch some of this? It's a good one." "I'm really tired." "Sure you are. So tired you'd sneak off without giving me a goodnight kiss. Hurts my feelings, you know." "I just really want to go to bed." "Then come kiss me goodnight." For a moment, she thought her treacherous feet would carry her over as always. But then a sudden pulse of remembered pain blossomed on her upper arms. She wrapped her arms about herself, found her body tender and painful to the touch. Then she ran. "Tabby, get back here!" the voice called. Then quieter. "Little bitch." She made it to the stairs and froze on the landing, with her eyes turned back from whence she had come. Something roiled within her. She felt she might throw up right there, with her heart jackhammering in her chest. Weak-kneed, she sank beside the banister. He'd probably only hurt her later for this. But she couldn't. Not tonight. Not ever if she could help it. After regaining herself, she made it upstairs and passed an ajar door through which a thin sheaf of light sliced the dark of the upstairs hall. She saw Mommy slumped in the bed, snoring, the bottle of pills sitting open on the nightstand, along with the empty wine glass. The sight filled Tabby with a white heat of anger, and she didn't know for a moment who she hated more. But that feeling was in turn swallowed back up by that lonesome pit in her stomach. She walked on. Her room was quiet, dark, and warm from the heat coming from the large ducted supply register. She curled up next to the warmth of the register on her comforter, which she stripped from the bed. The old dog-eared Bradbury book, which Daddy had loved so much, held tightly to her chest. After sitting like that for a time, she opened the book and began to read slowly, all the while listening for the sounds. And, if she were quiet enough, maybe the voices. Sleep held her, having crept over her quietly as an enchantment from a fairy tale, filling her mind with dreams. When the sounds came, they came in her dreams too, coloring the edges with laughter and summertime happiness. She might not have woken, so deftly were these images woven in her dreams, but her sleeping mind recognized the intrusion. Bolting upright, she leaned nearer the heating registers, which had now cooled, and listened to the memories that pulsed through the house. For she knew the house on Hyatt was old and beautiful and awash with memories, secrets, and perhaps even the ghosts which relived them. As much as she hated this town and the man which lay in a drunken stupor downstairs, she loved having come to this old house and its wonders. The memories were strong in the house tonight. She could clearly make out distinct voices in happy conversation drifting through the ductwork. One was small and high-pitched, not unlike her own. The other was deep and rich. It felt warm in her ears and as soothing as a soak in the tub. She couldn't help but think of Daddy when hearing that voice. That made her feel even warmer, but sad too. Tabitha stayed like that for a while, simply listening to the sounds of some distant but remembered lifetimes. Sometimes she thought about telling someone about the voices, but the idea always seemed a bad one. They had been here less than 6 months, and she still didn't have many friends in this strange town. After all, anyone she told wouldn't believe her, especially any grown-up. Grown-ups don't believe in anything interesting. Besides, people always seemed scared of things like this. It was better this way. A special show just for her. Something straight out of the fantasy books Daddy had liked so much. Whenever she closed her eyes, she could place the voices into different scenes, and often she imagined a backstory for each voice in her mind. She wished she could somehow join those stories. Then, gradually, she grew tired, and the hour grew late. Knowing the early awakening for school that was to come, she gathered herself to go to bed. As if on cue, the soft murmuring ceased, replaced by one sound, the solitary musical notes of the high-pitched voice.
Hello? Are you still listening?
Tabitha froze. She could almost swear it was talking to her, but the voices never talked back.
Please say you're there.
Came the voice again.
I felt you listening. I just want someone to talk to.
A ghost, she thought. A real-life ghost that wanted to talk to her. She felt giddy, but the strange turn also gave her pause. It took her a moment to find her voice before replying, "I'm here." A tinkling of laughter chiming in the middle of the ductwork came back.
You can hear me? Oh, wonderful! You can hear! You can hear!
And the pure delight of the voice sent a smile spreading across Tabitha's face. So it was, Tabby befriended a ghost in the house on Hyatt. As time went on, she realized the ghost wasn't like those she read about in her books or heard in classmates' stories. This ghost didn't come whispering through the walls or rattling chains in the halls. This ghost didn't scare Tabitha at all. When she came, she was just the quiet voice that drifted through the ducts of the house. Her name was Clarissa.
My daddy worked in a mill.
Clarissa explained one night.
My 2 brothers did too. What does your daddy do?
My daddy... I don't have a daddy anymore.
Oh,
The voice softened to a whisper.
isn't that your daddy downstairs?
No! Tabitha spat the word more violently than she meant to. He's just some man. I hate him.
Why do you hate him?
Tabitha felt sick suddenly. She realized she couldn't articulate the thing. When she tried, the words just wouldn't come. He'd said that it was part of being a good little girl, but she never remembered her daddy saying that. He hurts me sometimes, she said at last.
I'm sorry. You should meet my daddy sometime. You would love him. My brothers too.
I would really like that.
I knew you would. Come downstairs.
Tabitha's heart dropped. I can't.
Why not?
Because he's... As if on cue, she heard her reason coming up the hallway with heavy and shuffling steps. "Tabs?" came the slurring inquiry from the hall. "I have to go," she told the voice, and scrambled into bed, turning off the light. Scarcely had the room grown dark when she heard the door swing quietly open. She felt the weight of his shadow across her, but willed herself to remain motionless. "Tabs!" She gritted her teeth, willing him to leave, expecting to feel an alien touch at any moment, but the door swung closed. Motionless, she lay there for what seemed like hours, before tentatively crawling out of bed and back to the heating register. But it was no use. Carissa had gone. She was sad at first, all filled back up with that lonesomeness, but then realized just how tired she had become. She slept then and dreamed, and it seemed that maybe she could still hear the slightest whisper of sweet voices. And when she dreamed, it was of unworried summertime happiness, like sweet lemon drops, Daddy, and the bright faces of the memories from the house. And, though deep in sleep, a part of her recognized that if she could stay like this, she would rather that she never woke up. "May I be excused?" "Huh?" Mommy scarcely looked up from the phone beside her plate. "May I be excused?" "But you haven't finished your dinner," he replied for Mommy. "But I'm full." "Full, huh?" He wiped gravy from his mouth with a crumpled napkin. "What's the big hurry, anyway? Gonna go up and hide in your room? Been spending a lot of time up there lately. What's so good you don't have time for family anymore?" Tabitha scowled down at the remainder of peas on her plate. She lifted her eyes to Mommy, ignoring the man across from her. "Mommy, can I go?" "Hey!" He snapped his fingers, and the quick motion of his hand made her start reflexively. "I'm talking to you, little lady. Look at me when I'm talking to you." "Mom, don't be so rude, Tabs," Mommy said. "Yeah," he added. "I think you've been spending too much time by yourself lately. We should have a family night. Catch a movie on the TV." "But I don't want to." Tabitha's voice sounded shrill and pitiable in her own ears. That got Mommy to look up. "Damn it, Tabs! Why are you being such a brat?" She looked at Mommy and realized just how red her eyes were, how tired. She wanted to pour it all out then, even if she didn't have all the words. She wanted to say exactly why she didn't want to sit up with him, say why she hated him, say how she wished Mommy would just be happy again and come back from her eternal haze. But she saw him looking, and the look in his eye made her choke on the words. Mommy put a hand to her temple. "Please, just don't be difficult. Not tonight." Then Mommy was gone. Gone to the pills and the wine glass, and Tabitha realized for the first time to tears of her own. But when she was gone, he was still there. The hallway seemed darker than it ought to be, even at midnight. Maybe it was that the clouds smothered the moon, or that the drapes were set just so as to perfectly blot out the gleam of the solitary street lamp. Whatever the case, the walls pressed close, and shadow blended into shadow, so that, for a moment, Tabitha felt she could not recognize the hall's shape or discern its true length at all. But that was silly. There was nothing to be afraid of tonight. He hadn't come home from Sammy's pub yet, and that was just fine. She had been waiting for just such a night. Stealthily, Tabitha crept down the hall, past Mommy's darkened door, and down the stairs. She was halfway down the flight before she saw her. Carissa stood in a sliver of moonlight at the base of the stairs. The white glow revealed her as pale and beautiful with dark hair. Tabitha thought she couldn't be more than a year or two older than herself. When she saw Tabitha on the landing, Carissa grinned with perfectly white teeth. "Come down," Carissa urged in a whisper, for Tabitha had frozen where she stood. It wasn't that she was scared of the apparition's appearance, as she thought she might be, but something about seeing a ghost, a real ghost, in this embodied way shocked Tabitha. She had expected something insubstantial, but there she was, the owner of the voice, as solid as the stairs under Tabitha's feet, even leaving small indentations in the carpet as she swayed playfully from foot to foot. "I'm coming," Tabitha said at last, and descended the last flight of steps. When she reached the bottom, Carissa threw her arms around her, and Tabitha was chilled by the touch of cold but very real skin against her own. "I'm so glad you decided to come," Carissa whispered in her ear. "It's been so long since we've had good company. I can feel it. Your good company. Father will be very pleased." "But where's everyone?" "Waiting. Come and see." Carissa took her hand, and Tabitha felt overcome with new excitement. How many little girls could say that they were friends with a family of ghosts? Certainly not prissy Evelyn Green or that bratty Tina Thompson at school. They could jeer at her ratty clothes all they wanted. No matter how much money their mommies and daddies made, they would never have something as cool as this. They went down the dark hall toward the back of the house, past door after darkened door. When no signs of the other ghosts could be seen or heard, Tabitha asked, "Where are we going?" "Not much farther." Then they entered the kitchen. Carissa continued forward, but was stopped by Tabitha, whose feet fixed in the doorway. For, across from them, in the corner by the refrigerator, the door to the basement stood open. "What's wrong? We're almost there." Tabitha released Carissa's hand and stepped back. "I don't want to go down there." "But that's where we live. You want to meet the family, don't you? They'll be sad if you leave now." Another step back. I changed my mind." Carissa walked further into the kitchen and looked back sadly. "We thought you might be nice to us. It's been so long. I had a special surprise for you, too." Voices began drifting softly from below then. They were warm and comfortingly familiar, and above them all came a new one which made Tabitha's heart soar. It came deep and rich, seemingly pulled straight out of days past, and Tabitha knew it perfectly. "Daddy?" she said, and stepped into the kitchen. "Daddy, are you here?" "I am," came the voice, now joined by a face appearing appearing in the shadows of the basement door. "I've made new friends, beautiful. They told me I could find you here. I've missed you and Mommy so much." How could it be? Daddy had left them there on the side of the road in the glow of the hellish red ambulance lights. Yet here he was, just within the shadows of the basement door, as real and substantial as Carissa. She might have broken out into a run, flung herself into those beloved and much-missed arms. But her legs felt like jelly, and Tabitha could only manage a few stumbling steps forward. During those stumbling steps, the uncertainty returned. Daddy looked strange. Now that she was closer, she saw that his features were vague, unshaped. She realized then that she couldn't quite recall the fine details of Daddy's face. The man hadn't wanted Mommy to put up pictures of Daddy in the house. And now she too held an increasingly indistinct image of him in her mind, the one from her dreams. Now her eyes turned back on Carissa, and Tabitha almost screamed when she saw the thing in the girl's back. The shadows must have hidden it from her, but now with more moonlight pouring through the window above the sink, streaming over the girl's shoulder, Tabitha saw something long and wet that reminded her of the octopus at the aquarium, sprouting from Carissa's back and trailing wetly into the basement. Looking at the thing which was not quite Daddy, Tabitha knew that if he also turned around, he too would be trailing one of the slimy things. An absurd thought then. Puppets. Puppets of skin and bone. Deep from the darkness beyond the Daddy shape came the sounds of something slipping and sliding wetly, and a stench like the green trash bin she pushed to the street every week filled the air. A scream ripped from her throat as the tears streaked her face. She fled back through the hall and pounded on the stairs. As she went, the remembered voice of Daddy came after her. "Please, come back, baby. We don't want to hurt you." After that, she hated the house on Hyatt. At night, she would regard the radiator with dread and pray that the voices would not try to talk to her. For now, she heard underneath them that wet slipping and sliding that had seemed to come from under the basement stairs. She had tried to tell Mommy, but it didn't matter. When Tabitha had taken her back to the kitchen that night, all was as it ought to be. No smell hung in the air, no slime wet the floor. She would have pressed Mommy to open the basement door, but she was too afraid. Besides, he had come stumbling in shortly after, and she knew he might get mad if he thought she was telling a lie for attention. So, she lay quietly at night, feeling more alone than she had before, and wishing more than ever that she could get away from everything, or just sleep and dream and never have to wake up. The day was crisp and cool as she walked from the corner bus stop toward the house on Hyatt. Where once it seemed so beautiful and regal, if a little run down, it now looked like a crouching monster. She had no friends there now. Now she feared going home twice as much. First, of whatever lived beneath the house, and when he got off his shift at the plant, for fear of the man that lived in it. At least the thing in the basement couldn't seem to get her in her room. She closed the front door quietly behind her, eyes locked on the kitchen door, as had become her new habit. Usually, Mommy was home by now, but the house was quiet and her car was not in the driveway. "Mom?" She heard a shuffling. Then he came out of the living room, one hand around the neck of a half-empty liquor bottle, and Tabitha nearly screamed. "Where's Mom?" she asked, trying to keep the tremble out of her voice.
"Got held up, I guess. It's all right, though."
He walked toward her slowly and set the bottle down on a small table by the wall.
"We can have fun, just the two of us. You know how we do. Or do you? If I didn't know any better, I'd say you've been avoiding me."
Tabitha stepped away and felt her back touch the closed front door. A part of her screamed to turn and throw it open. She could be down the street before the stumbling drunk even made it down the porch steps. And yet she couldn't. The old fear held her fast, as it always did. She hated it, and hated that she felt so powerless, yet her feet would not move. He came nearer still.
"Come on, beautiful. Come give Daddy a kiss, and we'll throw something on the TV."
"You're not my daddy," she said quietly.
"What'd you say?"
"I said you're not my daddy." She found herself suddenly able to look up at him and felt all red hot inside. "You're not, and I hate you." What began as a patronizing grin suddenly soured to a snarl.
"And you're a little ungrateful bitch, but I think I can teach you some appreciation."
When he moved, it was deceptively fast and accurate for his state of inebriation, but Tabitha managed to dart past him. He cursed and collided with the door, while she ran down the main hall toward the kitchen, the back door, and escape. She knew she had a lead. She could probably climb over the back fence and be gone from him in moments. But the sight in the kitchen stopped her cold. The back door was in the kitchen's corner, set at a right angle to the nondescript white basement door, a door which was currently swinging open. The rotten smells came to her, and Tabitha thought she could hear a wet sliding coming up the creaking steps. But then he came pounding down the hallway with a bellow, and she decided it didn't matter. She made for the door and threw it open before strong hands, his hands, lifted her full from the floor and yanked her back. His breath stank with whiskey and cigarettes as it rolled over her shoulder with his curses. She reached out and grabbed the doorframe, causing him to squeeze her hard and yank again. Tears brimmed in her eyes as one of her nails was torn away. She threw her head back, intending a scream, but received a dull clop of pain as her head connected with his jaw. He stumbled then, releasing her as his arms pinwheeled for balance. When she heard his scream, it sounded muffled and hollow. Only when she turned did she see that he had fallen back into the open basement door. She heard him moan, but the sound was lost under weird squelching. She shut the basement door and sat by it, listening for the shriek she knew would come. But none came. The squelching sounds continued for a few minutes. Then all was silent. Tabitha felt sick and wobbly-legged when she stumbled into the living room and collapsed on the couch and into a numb daze. Part of her screamed to run anywhere, just get out of the house. But she felt like a boulder of exhaustion sat on her shoulders and wanted more than anything to pass into a deep sleep of ignorance. Her body seemed to shut down, but her mind would not quiet. He was gone. She had not looked to see what had become of him, but she knew he would not be getting back up. Yet, as relieving as this thought was, she could only worry. What would she tell Mommy? Mommy had never listened before, likely never would have believed the things he had done. What would she think now? Tabitha felt anxious butterflies bounce around in her belly and wondered if she would be sent to a prison for little girls who killed people, even if the people were bad. But she hadn't killed him. Not really. The thing had. And that was the other part of it. While the monster in the house may be gone, the one beneath it was still there, with its many faces and voices. When would it come for her and Mommy? If only they could leave this awful house. Not since the night after Daddy died had she felt so hollowed by worry. As all the thoughts, which seemed too grown up for a little girl to be holding, swirled around, she picked up his Zippo lighter from between the other booze bottles on the coffee table and began to flick the top up and down, up and down. For a time, she drifted into her own world of thought, floating along with the simple rhythm of the Zippo's lid. Then, the footsteps came from the hall. "Mommy?" she asked, some part of her knowing full well it was not. He stepped into view, and her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she faced the horrible prospect that he had not died, but had only been knocked out by his fall down the stairs. But she knew this was false at once. He had no marks from his fall, no bruises or scrapes. Rather, his skin looked almost shiny, fresh in some strange way, and he smiled in a way she had never known him to in life. "Hey there, Tabs. I just wanted to let you know it's all right." "Stay away from me," she said, rising to her feet. He held out hands to her that looked fresh as baby skin. "Don't be like that, Tabs. All is forgiven. I know I've been bad, but I'm better now. I've been made better. I think we can all be better together now." As he stepped farther into the room, Tabby glimpsed the writhing appendage sprouting from his back. She knew at once that he was dead, and yet a part of whatever lived in the basement somehow. This was not truly him, but a memory, a mask made in the likeness of the real man, like all the other masks. "Come with me," the thing said, as it crept into the living room, trailing mucus in its wake. "I'll take you to the others, and you won't have to worry anymore. Then, when your mommy comes home, she can come too. You can be with your daddy again." With horror, she thought of the unfinished daddy thing she had seen in the kitchen, and realized that whatever was in the basement had been in her head all along, riding the coattails of the dreams, maybe. That's how it had tried to make a mask of Daddy. The thought brought not only a jolt of violating fear, but a flash of red-hot anger. "Come with me, and we can all rest," said the thing.
You're so tired. Little girls shouldn't have to carry so much weight. I know you've been hurting so much. Come sleep and dream your dreams for us."
"You're a liar!" she screamed back. "You're just like him, and you just want to hurt us!"
Mirth left the false face.
"Come along now, Tabby."
His voice changed. The ventriloquist imitation dropped away to a harsh and hissing voice, as if the breath were being forced into the thing's lungs. All at once, the mask began to dissolve completely. Teeth grew to fangs. Eyes sunk wetly back into staring sockets, and fingers became hooked claws of nightmare. It leaped at her. When Tabby acted, it was out of repressed anger and fearful reflex. She seized one of the empty liquor bottles and threw it. With an ugly squish, the glass split ahead, which parted like gelatin as the thing stumbled. She darted past it toward the doorway, but not before seeing its head beginning to reform like potter's clay. Tabitha leaped but fell hard, chin striking the ground as the thing clutched her ankle. She looked back to see its hold on her, to see it crawling closer, head still reshaping as it came. Her foot flailed in the clawed hand, but would not come free. All the while, the thing dragged itself nearer. Then, Tabitha became aware of something in her tightened fist and realized she still held the Zippo. She flicked it open and shoved the flame down toward the clutching claw. Immediately, it drew back, the thing's fleshy appendage wavering and shrinking, trying to escape the small flame. Scrambling to her feet, she gained the hall and made for the front door, but another shape leaped from the dining room to bar her path. This shape was smaller and wore a white dress, but the features had been so twisted that Tabitha hardly recognized Carissa as she came at her. Reflexively, Tabitha held up the lighter, and the creature paused to consider the small flame.
"I know you don't like this,"
Tabitha said. She tried to make her voice as big and mean as possible, tried not to show how scared she was.
"I'll burn you with it if you come closer. Don't think I won't."
"Tabby." The voice was hollow and unrecognizable. She glanced back and saw him slinking around the corner with his gaping sockets and the alien voice coming from his distended jaw. "Come with us now. Come and sleep. You don't have to keep fighting." Tabitha looked at him, the thing with his shape. Slime poured from his orifices, and all semblance of the man seemed to be running out of him, leaving only a monster. She thought absently that this memory was more honest than his appearance in life.
"I won't do what you tell me!"
she screamed. The red hotness had come back as she looked at the loathsome shape.
"I won't let you hurt me or Mommy anymore!"
She glanced to the side and seized the half-finished whiskey bottle he'd left on the hall table.
"Go to hell!"
In a flash, Tabitha found herself living out a fantasy she'd not realized that she'd harbored ever since he came into her life. She threw the whiskey bottle at his now malformed head and watched with delight as it broke, drenching him with the amber liquid. The thing with his shape bellowed, knife-like bits of glass protruding from its soft flesh. And then it came at her. But now Tabitha felt no fear. Now she felt only anger for the man that had been and what he had done. Anger for the manipulations on all sides. All at once, she remembered him that night in the living room, that zombie movie that had been on TV, and she gently tossed the open Zippo into his oncoming face. At first, there was only a brief guttering. Then, flames raced across the monstrous head as the liquor caught fire. The thing howled and flailed blindly, clattering against the walls of the hallway in a panic. Another shriek split the air, and Tabitha turned to see the Carissa thing writhing on the floor, as well clutching at its face. Tabitha got an idea and darted past the clutching claws of the burning monster before her and around the strange appendage drooping from its back towards the kitchen. The thing stumbled behind in clumsy pursuit. Tabitha climbed up on the counter and opened a cabinet where he had kept more liquor. "I know how much you like your booze, so you can have it!" Unscrewing the top, she swung the bottle down, releasing an arc of liquid like a priest casting holy water on the possessed. The flames leapt up greedily in response, and the creature staggered, falling to its knees. With dread fascination, Tabitha saw that the appendage from the thing's back was flailing wildly and retracting, ripping free from the smoldering shape and dragging back down toward the basement. But Tabitha paid it little mind as she continued to feed the hungry flames which lapped at the melting shape that had once been him. Now the flames rose tall with black smoke that stung her eyes, and the fire began creeping up the walls and across the kitchen floor. A sound came up from the blackness below, a bellowing, low and mournful. In it was the sound of a merciless wind blowing up from depths of void to tear at the crevices of her mind, harsh and unforgiving. The sound filled Tabitha up, and she shrank within herself in the wake of a presence, vast and alien. She screamed and ran, racing down the hall and bounding over the writhing thing that looked like a little girl before breaking into the waning light of the day. The house on Hyatt burned bright, and Tabitha watched it from a neighbor's house across the street. They had found her wandering the street in a daze after the noxious smoke began to pervade the air. Once or twice she thought she saw shapes rising from the flames, but they each fell away in turn. The fire department was fast, but by the time they arrived, the house on Hyatt, which had stood there for so many years, was little more than an ashen wreckage. When Mommy came bursting in, Tabitha cringed reflexively, afraid of what she might say. But then Tabitha saw that Mommy's eyes were clean and clear in a way she had not seen since Daddy. "Tabs! Oh, thank God! I thought—" Mommy held her close, and Tabitha returned the embrace. "He did this, didn't he? What, passed out with a cigarette? I'm sorry." "No, don't say that." "But, Mommy—" "Shh, don't worry about anything. You just calm down. Just glad you're okay." And as the last shuddering breath of smoke left the house on Hyatt, Tabitha felt at peace for the first time in months. The house on Hyatt was gone. The monsters were gone. Ash to ash, dust to dust. In time, this too would fade. Yet, as Tabitha watched smoke curl about the legs of the plodding firemen, she wondered if monsters are ever really gone for good. She would have to look out now, not just for herself, but for Mommy, against whatever else might be out there. Because even now, she couldn't help but wonder if those firemen heard faint whispers rising about them. Whispers of a little girl calling for help from below. And she gripped Mommy ever tighter.
All right! How about that for an image that will stick with you? And don't forget about the doppelganger puppets, still connected by tentacles. Ugh, that was exceedingly unsettling. The night world that plays out in our dreams has been the subject of much myth. The monster in this story is a sort of parasitic dream catcher, wouldn't you say? It invaded Tabitha's dreams and stole images, and presumably fed off of them while she was asleep. And try not to think too hard about what might have been coming through the vents to allow the monster that kind of access. I do love it when a terrible character gets their comeuppance. My only wish is that the man might have suffered further. I like to think he was still conscious in there in some way, and he felt the fire from his liquor race around his new body, even as the psychic monster ate away at his sense of self. If you enjoyed this story, please check out more from Mr. Hilton in the playlist I will link in a few moments. Please also check out his book, Nightside Tales, where you can read plenty more stories like this one. Please also leave a like on this video and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Whatever you do, don't linger long next to the vents. And don't fall asleep.